Bolinda Audio presents this unabridged recording of The Calling, written by Jane Goodall and read by Nikki Paul. The dedication reads, For Jack. London, summer 1976. Chapter 1. Bryony's office was on the side of the building that caught the afternoon sun, and the heat had been building relentlessly over the past couple of hours. When she opened the window, there was no breeze, only the backdraft from the passing traffic. She stood there for a moment, breathing in the petrol fumes, then returned to her desk and stared at the pile of CID reports. As she reached for a large buff folder, her eye was distracted by the greeting card sitting on the desk next to it, and she picked that up instead, smiling as she gazed at the French Impressionist picture of sailing boats on a blue-green sea. It was a birthday card, inscribed in Commander Macready's italic handwriting, wishing her every success in the coming year. Just like him to make the personal gesture, choosing a card that promised scenes of happy escape, then to sign it like that. Macready could never escape his own professional formality. Since his latest promotion, he had retreated to a glassed-in suite of offices on an upper floor at Paddington Green, and those who had known him in his former incarnation as a working detective gossiped about the waste and the irony. He'd always been so contemptuous of the paperwork approach in CID, keeping formidable amounts of detail filed in his head for immediate access at all hours of the day or night, and maintaining an unstinting pace with his small, hand-picked team. Being in that team meant unrelenting stress, but Bryony missed it. Since she'd moved to her new job in Chelsea, BD Division, she'd been getting paper-bound herself. She replaced the card and drew a pile of documents towards her with a sigh, but was relieved by a knock on the door. "Excuse me, ma'am, you got a minute?" Before she had a chance to reply, Dennis came in and dropped a green folder on her desk, then plonked himself in the chair opposite her in his usual posture, arms folded and legs splayed in front of him. He was a few years older than her, somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed, and although she was starting to get better at dealing with older men as her juniors, she always anticipated difficulties. At BD, she'd already encountered all their usual games of undermining, but Dennis, to his credit, hadn't been playing them. He had a relaxed, good-humoured way about him, too relaxed for a detective sergeant. "Phew, stuffy in here, innit?" He rotated his head and ran a finger round the back of his collar. "It's stuffy everywhere, Dennis. What's this you've brought me? I'm drowning in reports already." "Missing persons. See these?" He opened the folder and began to lay its contents out in front of her. "What about them? Missing persons is a job for the uniforms." "Yes." He straightened up the papers side by side. "That's it, you see." Dennis liked to place stress on some of his words, as if every trivial statement needed special definition. "I've been having a chat with the sergeant who keeps the files. He's getting a bit concerned, you see, because there's so many teenagers. He's got 3 cases already this month of teenagers going AWOL after they left home to go to some rock concert or other down this way. He's wondering if we've got a bit of an epidemic on our hands. He thinks the CRD should be in the loop in case there's some particular reason for it." "As if we haven't got enough to do." She picked up one of the forms and looked at the photograph of a curly-haired girl with too much eye makeup, then glanced through the notes, description of the clothes the girl was wearing, mostly black, schedule of her activities over the previous week, interviews with parents, teachers, school friends, lists of addresses checked. "Looks like they've done a thorough job," she said. "Last seen by a couple of her mates at the Triangle Club in the King's Road. Dennis pointed to another form. "Same with this lad here." Bryony gathered up the forms. The triangle. How many people did they have there last Saturday night? 300? 400? We haven't got time to go chasing after badly behaved rock groups, asking them the whereabouts of their fans. But we'll keep an eye on the situation. As she handed back the file, the phone rang. "Message from one of the rapid response cars, ma'am. Bravo 2. They're following up on a 999 call, reporting a body by the Thames, Chelsea Embankment, a few yards west of the Battersea Bridge." "Has the coroner's officer been called out?" "Yes, the divisional surgeon's on his way too." She hung up. "Got a pair of wellies in your locker, Dennis? You might need them." The river, or what remained of it, made a strange graveyard. Bryony stared at the assorted garbage lodged in the mud, thinking, only one body in all this lot? It looked as though corpses might be spontaneously produced in there, black slimy things with tangled limbs and no faces, popping up to the surface in clumps. Dennis joined her, leaning on the wall. "Old Father Thames. Not doing much rolling along just here, is he? I'll get the ladder." Glad she'd chosen her older canvas slacks to wear this morning, Bryony pulled on the outsized Wellington boots and climbed onto the wall. She was contemplating the 5-foot drop on the other side when the coroner's officer arrived, accompanied by an improbably young-looking doctor whom she recognised. He'd attended a couple of suicide scenes she'd dealt with in the past few months. "Don't jump, ma'am," he said as he walked towards her. "You'll find the world looks a lot worse from the other side of that wall." A broad smile and a hand held out in greeting showed the remark was prompted by a wayward sense of humour. He got up on the wall next to her and surveyed the scene. "What a god-awful mess. Well, we should look on the bright side, Inspector Williams. It might deter a few suicides. You wouldn't want to jump off Battersea Bridge into this, would you?" Dennis set the ladder in place, and they climbed down, with the coroner's officer leading the way. As Bryony stepped onto the foreshore, the sole of her boot broke the caked surface of the mud, and she had to extract it from the sucking morass underneath. "Where's the body, then?" asked the doctor brightly. A uniformed officer was standing guard, but you couldn't see what he was supposed to be guarding. "Well, there's no actual body, sir, as such. Just this." The officer pointed to a naked foot, lying at the edge of the water. The leg was detached below the knee. Stranger things had been thrown up by the river, but this was the first time she'd witnessed the finding of an isolated body part. The coroner's officer picked the thing up and laid it on a sheet of plastic, then turned it over. He glanced at Bryony. "Probably male, judging by the foot. Big-boned. I wouldn't say that was normal decomposition," he said, pointing to the blackened mess above the ankle. She looked around. Maybe not. But decomposition would be quicker in this heat, wouldn't it? The coroner's officer began to wrap it, but she noticed something. "Wait, let me have another look." She crouched and turned it over again, brushing some of the mess from around the ankle. "What's this?" It was a ridge of black stuff, clogged with mud and oil, but she could discern ridges in the outline. Chain of some kind? On the pathologist's estimation, the limb was from a male body, probably aged 18 to 28, and it was less than 36 hours since... Since what? Bryony pulled her chair in closer and went back through the report. They couldn't be sure the person attached to that leg was actually dead. But if he was, they were looking at murder, or a very nasty accident. The upper end of the shin bone was badly disintegrated and blackened in a manner consistent with burning. Possibly, the pathologist suggested, someone had been trying to dispose of the corpse in an incinerator of some kind and failed to get it all in. The thing round the ankle was in fact a piece of chain, but when they examined it closely, they couldn't see how it might have served for restraint. It was a section of bicycle chain, cut to fit the ankle and fastened with a padlock, A cheap little thing, not even stainless steel. Damn, she muttered to herself. There would have to be an investigation, and one of the most difficult kind, just as her holiday was coming up. Had she been letting that influence her this morning? Was she getting slack like Dennis? Should she have called the Soccos to the scene before the body part was removed? Well, better late than never. And if this was a job for the forensics, she must make sure it was in good hands. She reached for the phone, called the Lambeth Laboratory, and identified herself briskly. I need to talk to Dr. Pavantanandan. Can you tell me where he might be? Right here, Mum. Just give him a minute to get his gloves off. She was rehearsing a persuasive opening when the even baritone came on the line. Bryony, how do I always know when you're going to ring me? What is it this time? Her rehearsed gambit went west. A piece of charred leg found in the Thames. Funeral parlours getting careless with their cremations. Does no one do their job properly these days? There's a sort of anklet attached to it, to the body part, I mean. Look, Pavan, it's not the most glamorous case, but as I'm sure you'll appreciate, the Thames shoreline under Battersea Bridge isn't for an easy investigation site in this weather. Will you come down and have a look? He agreed to meet her there in an hour. In the meantime, she decided to walk down via the lower end of the King's Road, where bits of old hardware were appearing as the latest fashion accessory. She liked walking. Since the uniforms did most of their patrolling in the cars now, there was often a lack of on-the-ground knowledge, the kind you got from going past houses on foot, overhearing snatches of talk, seeing the graffiti and the handmade bills pasted up on the telegraph poles, reading the body language of the groups hanging around in the street. The notorious shop at number 430, which kept changing its name, but whose sign currently read Sex in massive pink letters, was surrounded as usual by hangers-on, wearing mohair vests in the still clinging heat. They glowered at her, as they did at everyone, but it was possible she was recognised. She'd been around here from time to time asking questions, and she'd be having to ask more. As she approached, she noticed the door was open. You never could tell when this place was going to be open. She steeled herself and went in. They did their best to intimidate you in here. Apart from all the black rubber clothes and chicken-wired decor, the attitude of the shop assistants was enough to make any normal human being turn tail and run. Bryony went straight to the counter and showed her card to the girl with the geometric eye makeup and the hairdo that reminded her of an ice cream sundae. You again, said the girl expressionlessly. Her steady gaze made Bryony acutely aware of her own limp hair and faded cotton jacket. What are you looking for now? Suspender belt? She rotated her hips suggestively. What you got in the way of bracelets, or anklets to be exact? The girl slapped a box on the counter, full of what looked like dog collars. Some were just scraggy pieces of old cracked leather with a few studs on them, which might actually have been pinched off the family dog. Others were wider and flashier, made of new materials, the kind of thing normally associated with the S&M trade. Run out of handcuffs? Asked the girl, deadpan. Bryony kept her own face straight. Any of the people you see in here like to wear bike chain? Most of them. Not against the law, is it? All right, said Bryony. We'll leave it for now. But I may have some more questions later. I appreciate your help. The girl smiled, artificially, as if for a camera. Pleasure. Bryony crossed the road and threaded her way along Millman Street, past the old burial ground to the river. It smelt worse than she remembered. The heat of the day must have seeped into the mud and set it festering, a forensics nightmare, even for someone of Pavan's capabilities. Pavan was another of Macready's inner circle. He was prized for his expert knowledge, Oxford educated and with an accent to match. Bryony had worked with him on a few cases when she was based in Oxford, where the junior officers referred to him as Prince Pavan. He'd moved on Macready's persuasion to a London posting and was having to deal with all the hustle of the Lambeth lab. He arrived 15 minutes late, wearing polished shoes and a double-breasted suit, but accompanied by Ken, the lab liaison sergeant, who was dressed for the dirty work. "I'll get down there if I have to," said Pavan, "but I'm summoned to the commander's office at 4 o'clock and would prefer not to go in wafting eau de Thames." Bryony rolled up the legs of her slacks and went down herself, leading the way to the spot. She began to describe the grisly find, but Pavan interrupted from above. "We've seen it. We came here via the mortuary." "Oh, yes. Any observations?" "He was wearing ill-fitting shoes. There's a blister on the heel." He drew a breath, but didn't continue. "And?" She was getting impatient. "It's possible we may be able to get a fingerprint off the padlock if there was oil on it. The conditions of preservation are against us, obviously, but a padlock is typically held firmly between the forefinger and the thumb, so if the impress was strong enough, we may be lucky." Pavan placed one finely shod foot on the wall and leant over. "We're looking for traces of rust from the padlock and chain, or charring from the end of the bone. If we find those in the surrounding mud, it will give us an indication that it's lain here for some time. Otherwise, we can infer it's recently been washed up from somewhere else." "Any ideas about the owner?" "The owner of the leg? Male. Are you asking me to be more specific?" "Age," said Bryony, "is what I'm wondering about. We're dealing with more than our usual quota of missing teenagers in these parts." "The usual quota being considerable, I imagine." "Quite considerable. It's getting a bit wild around the lower end of the King's Road. They're wearing chains and padlocks as personal ornaments, along with a lot of uglier stuff. Leather masks, swastikas, broken razor blades." Ken looked up from his work, scooping the ooze into plastic containers with a spatula. "Swastikas? I saw a character only the other day with a swastika tattooed on the side of his head. He was hanging out near the lab entrance in Lambeth, waiting to do some drug deal, no doubt." "Let's hope that was all he was waiting for," she said. Chapter 2. Sharon stared at the exam paper. "Write your name, centre number and candidate number in the space provided on the front of the answer book. Sharon Kendall. You got 2% for that, apparently, writing your name on the answer book. 2 down, 98 to go." The front page of the question paper was all instructions, with the words "must" and "not" in capital letters. Answers must be written in black. Do not use pencil or coloured ink. The world was full of people wanting to give you orders and make you answer questions about measurements and quantities. She opened the answer book, picked up a red biro, and wrote a question of her own. "What do you call a hole 2 miles wide and 3 miles long?" Answer: Watford. The next question wasn't so easy. "Why am I sitting here?" Where else was there to go? That was the short answer, given she was living in a town that was a complete hole, and she didn't have the money to go anywhere else or anyone to go with. At least tomorrow she'd be getting out of this hole for the day. Maths was the last exam for most of the class, so they were going on an excursion to celebrate the end of all the swatting and sweating. Not that Sharon had done much of that. The excursion was Terry Kent's idea, of course, Mr. Popularity, with his long wavy hair and his velvet jacket and his new red MG. He taught art, the only subject Sharon liked, but she was sceptical about Terry, as he let them call him. She could see his real aim in life was impressing the girls. Why else would he be the only male teacher in a private girls' school? Sharon had been there 4 years, and she didn't fit any better now than the first day she walked in the door. She remembered that day, because the minute she opened her mouth, they started giving her funny looks. Wrong class of girl, wasn't she? "What does your father do?" That's what they asked her, straight up. "My father's a lawyer, and it's him that pays the fees for this piss-awful school. He never wants to see me, but he has to make sure I get a good education." Actually, that's what Sharon didn't say. What she did say was, "I dunno. I don't have a father. Not that I'm acquainted with, anyhow." Then a few months ago, a couple of them saw her at the weekend, trailing down the high street after the family. She got challenged first thing on Monday morning. "Thought you said you didn't have a father. Who was that man carrying your baby brother?" "I don't have a brother. It's my half-sister Deborah, wearing dungarees, and just because she's got a father doesn't mean I have. I'm too old to need a daddy, unlike some people." When she turned 16 last April, she decided she was going to move out as soon as the school year finished, which was just about now, seeing there weren't going to be any more classes after the exams. "Why am I sitting here?" She stared at the words she'd written. There'd been plenty of times recently when she could have just walked out, like last Monday night. She'd been smoking some pot in her bedroom, just to chill out a bit after the stress of sitting all day in the exam room. But Mike got wind of it, and she ended up being dragged into the kitchen for a showdown. Mum had Debbie sitting on her hip and was trying to do the washing up with one hand. She started telling Sharon that if she messed up her O-levels, she'd spend the rest of her life behind a counter somewhere. The lecture went on and on until Mum was actually crying about it, and Debbie started squawking along with her and making her worse by trying to pull her hair. Then Mike thumped the table and shouted, "That's it! I'm going to put my foot down!" "You go right ahead," Sharon said to him. "Flat-footed prats like you are always putting their feet down. It's lifting them up that's the problem. I can get lift off whenever I like." When she woke up on Friday morning, Sharon's first thought was that this was the end of the road, but what she couldn't figure out was where she could go from here. She lay on her back for a while, then rolled over because the sun was shining in her eyes, and there was Debbie, standing next to the bed, waiting to ambush her. That was Mum's doing. She had a habit of bringing Debbie in there first thing in the morning, then going back to bed herself. Sharon knew exactly what it was about. They locked the bedroom door in the mornings. Her and the Pratt. Debbie was making jerky knee bends, holding onto the side of the bed and going ah with her mouth wide open. That meant she wanted to be lifted onto the bed. She liked to plant the top of her head in the quilt and upend herself, making buzzing noises through her lips. Sharon was supposed to catch hold of her feet. Debbie seemed to get an incredible thrill out of that, and as soon as she was let go, she demanded a repeat performance. Upside down, upside down! It occurred to Sharon that if Debbie was made to behave properly, she could turn into a reasonable sort of a sister. But as this thought was passing through her mind again, she noticed that an expression of intense concentration had come over Debbie's face, which meant only one thing: dirty nappy. As the telltale sounds and smells exploded, Sharon swept her up under the armpits and took her back to her cot, calling to alert Mum to the emergency. Returning to her own room, she shut the door and put on her school uniform, then glared at herself in the wardrobe mirror. Who invented this ridiculous gear, anyway? Pleated skirts and ties. The only people who really liked it were pinched-up school teachers and dirty old men. She was first down in the kitchen, hoping to catch her mother before Mike appeared, and touch her up for a couple of quid. Mum put Debbie in the high chair and gave her a bowl of stewed apple, and Debbie began doing what she usually did, which was to scoop up a spoonful of it and throw it over her shoulder. So Mum took the spoon off her and tried to put the stuff in her mouth, but Debbie made a horrible grunting noise and twisted around so she nearly upset the chair. "Why don't you give her something crunchy to eat?" Sharon said. "She's got teeth, hasn't she?" "Don't be rude, Sharon. Get yourself some toast, will you? And do a couple of pieces for Mike. Sharon put the bread in the toaster.
Want toast?
Debbie piped up.
Want toast?
There was a lot of squealing and squirming then, till she was let out of the high chair with a finger of toast in her slimy fist. Sharon broached the question. You know, we've got that excursion up to London today. Can I have some extra money for expenses? Mum gave a sort of little huff, but it didn't sound too unfriendly. You better look in my purse. That was just the moment Mike chose to come slouching in. By the expression on his face, it was evident he was still smarting over the Pratt remark. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Mum came over to take the purse. "She wants a bit of extra pocket money, that's all, for expenses." She picked out £3 notes and was about to hand them over. "What expenses?" "She's going to London with the school. Then she can take a packed lunch like the rest of us." He turned on Sharon. "And you're lucky to get that the way you behave. You want to learn some respect. Some kids your age would be grateful to have a decent home, let alone all the fancy extras." Sharon said she'd do without lunch and left. Chapter 3. It was a bloody hot day. Not the kind of day you want a school blazer stuck on your back. But when she got to the school, Mrs. Andrews was there watching them get on the coach and checking out their appearance. They were driven straight through the middle of London, with all the girls crowding up at the windows to look at the places they'd much rather go than the Tate Gallery, like Madame Tussauds and the Oxford Street shops. They started spotting fab outfits on passers-by. But as they drove along the embankment, they saw two girls who provoked a general outburst of giggling. Their hair was dyed stark white and stood out around their heads in stiff little peaks. One of them wore a very short tartan skirt and army boots, and the other was dressed in black, with chains all over her. When the coach finally stopped outside the Tate, everyone was complaining about the heat. But Mrs. Andrews insisted they keep their blazers on, knotted their ties correctly, and tucked their shirts in. Walking down the aisle of the coach with her chin tucked in against her neck and her glasses slipping down her nose, she did an inspection. Then she told them they had 10 minutes for a snack and a drink on the grass before they went into the gallery. Most of the girls joined the queue for the ice cream van, and seeing Sharon didn't have any money, she crossed the road to take a look at the river. The 3 people she'd noticed before were approaching along the pavement. They walked past her as if she didn't exist. She watched them cross the road to the gallery and saw how the people sitting on the grass turned to stare at them. Terry had prepared a tour, and that meant they had to go around in a cluster while he got to stand out the front by the paintings and talk all the time. Some of the other visitors in the gallery stopped by to listen to him, and Mrs. Andrews left him to it and went back to wait in the coach.
"William Blake's work is all about energy," Terry began.
Sharon tried to ignore what he was saying, standing at the back so she could look at the pictures in her own way. But she couldn't help hearing the lecture.
"See how these bodies he draws are muscular and power-packed."
There was a scattering of giggles as he pointed to the image of a naked man leaping out of a cloud of flame.
"But then see here, the ankle is shackled. Look at how many of the figures in these pictures are bound with chains. Blake was angry about the way the energies of life were locked up, energies of the mind as well as the body. He said the worst chains are the ones in here."
Terry pointed a finger at the centre of his own forehead.
"Mind-forged manacles, that was his term for them. And he blamed those chains of the mind for the fact other people didn't see the visions he saw, like this one."
The picture was of a weird monster with a giant man's body and the face of a reptile. It was stalking across the ground with its neck bent forward from the shoulders as if it was about to pounce on something.
"You wouldn't think that was a flea now, would you?" Terry asked. "But the painting is called Ghost of a Flea, and it came out of one of Blake's visions. He lived in a world full of supernatural forms. As they came out of the Blake room, they passed the toilets, and Terry said if they had to go, he'd meet them upstairs in the first of the Turner galleries. Sharon didn't feel like standing around in a queue in the ladies', so she went back to take another look at the Blakes in peace. It's true, she thought, they're full of energy. There were figures leaping up and down, turning in the air, rising out of flames. An elderly man in a uniform came in and smiled at her. "These are my favourites too," he said. "I'd sit in here for hours, given the chance. Aren't you going to join your friends? They'll be thinking you've got yourself lost." That'd be a stroke of luck, Sharon thought. But it didn't look like that kind of luck was coming her way. There was always somebody keeping an eye out for you, making sure you kept the shackles on. Why didn't people just mind their own business? Well, there was one place nobody could keep an eye on you, and that was the toilets. There were only a few girls left in there, fixing up their makeup, so Sharon locked herself in one of the cubicles for a while, just listening till the other doors stopped opening and closing. She waited another few minutes before she came out. But she found she didn't exactly have the place to herself, because there was a girl leaning over the wash basin with her face right up to the mirror and a paintbrush in her hand. It was one of the girls she'd seen on the embankment. She had a thick black line painted down her forehead and right through the middle of her eyebrow, across her eyelid, and finishing in a curl at the top of her cheek. She was painting over the eyelid with dark purple, but the other eye wasn't made up at all, and her lips were done almost white. Sharon was washing her hands, trying to look without exactly staring, but after a bit she just stood there and honestly gawped. There was so much to look at, like the stark white hair with black roots, the safety pin through one ear where you'd normally put an earring, and the shiny, low-cut black vest that she was busting out of. And the chains. She had them everywhere, wound round one wrist and up her arm, hanging in rows across her back, looped from the belt around her waist. The girl didn't seem to mind being watched. She just went on painting, going over the black line down the right side of her face. When she'd done, she rinsed the brush and put it back in her bag, which looked like it was made from bits of old petticoats, then stared back. "Seen enough?" Sharon pointed to the chains on her wrist. "Where did you get them?" "Where'd you think? It's lavatory chain." "Well, there's none of that in here. It's all push button." "Of course. It's no use looking in a place like this. There are public toilets down on the embankment." The girl started rummaging through the bag and pulled out a pair of scissors, which she used to trim off bits and pieces of her hair. "I saw you walking along there earlier on," said Sharon, "on the embankment." "What about it?" "I saw your little friends going up the stairs," said the girl. "Shouldn't you be with them?" "No. I'm thinking I need a bit of a change. Give me a lend of those scissors, would you?" The girl turned around. That's when Sharon noticed her black vest was made of rubber. It squeaked against the edge of the basin. She held out the scissors, snapping the blades a couple of times before she let Sharon take them. "Right, this is it," said a voice in Sharon's head. Actually, Sharon rather liked her hair. It was pale brown and quite thick, and it came up smooth and glossy when she washed it, which she'd done only the night before. But looking at herself in the mirror next to the other girl, she just thought, it's nice hair, but it makes you look ordinary. So she made a jab at it, and took out a chunk just above her ear. Then another, and another, till she'd cut a trench all the way round. The girl lit a cigarette and watched. "What's your name?" "Sharon. What's yours?" "Zig. How old are you?" 17. Sharon added a year, but maybe Zig guessed that. "Why don't you give me a hand?" "First, I want to see what you come up with. Keep going." Sharon took off her blazer and looked at herself in the white school shirt with its little hard collar and the striped tie. "I'll give you 50 pence for the tie," said Zig. "We collect them."
"Who's we?"
"And if you cut the pocket off the blazer, I'll give you another 20p for that. I could use the badge. Tell you what, throw in the shirt and I'll give you £2 for the lot."
An extra couple of pounds would come in handy, Sharon figured, but she had to wear something. She picked up the blazer and turned it inside out to expose the navy blue lining. It was worn pretty thin around the back, but it might do. She slit around the neck and the bottom of the sleeves, and it came away in her hand. When she tried it on, it made a sort of a little shirt, but the gap at the front showed an expanse of white bra, so she took off the bra and chucked it in the swing-top bin in the corner. Zig lodged the cigarette in the corner of her mouth and made a slow clapping gesture, then pulled something out of her bag.
"Here, present for you."
It was a string of safety pins, different sizes. Sharon started trying to pin the front of the lining together from the inside, but that made Zig laugh. She grabbed the pins back, picked a few of the bigger ones, and fastened them across the outside so they showed up.
"Get in there,"
Zig said.
"But you need to get those sleeves off."
She tossed the butt of her cigarette into one of the toilet bowls and started to cut around the top of the arm. That was when they heard the voices. They were coming right for the door, so Sharon hardly had a split second to act.
"Sharon? Sharon!
She must be in there."
"Are you in there?"
She grabbed the blazer and nipped into a cubicle. As she turned to close the door, she saw Zig dump her bag in the basin to cover up all the hair clippings. "Oh, sorry." The voice seemed unnecessarily loud and chirpy.
"We're looking for a girl called Sharon. Long hair, brown eyes, about my height, bit chubby round the knees."
There was a burst of giggles. Hands started pummeling on the toilet door.
"Do you mind?" said Zig. "There's a friend of mine in there. She's not feeling well. Got the shits, as a matter of fact. Give her a bit of peace and quiet, can't you?"
"Oh, sorry, but we do have to find Sharon. Sure you haven't seen her anywhere? Long brown hair."
"You already said. I haven't seen anyone like that."
"If you do, would you report it to the front desk out there? We're worried she's got herself lost." There was the sound of the outside door creaking as it opened again, then swung closed.
"All clear,"
said Zig. Sharon came out, sensing that she had gone up a bit in Zig's estimation, seeing there was an actual hunt on for her now. Both of them recognised the need to act fast. Zig finished ripping out the sleeves of the top, then wetted and soaped her hands and ran them through Sharon's hair so it stood out sharp and stiff. Sharon got to work on her school skirt, cutting off about 6 inches and making a slit down the side. Then she used the rest of the safety pins to connect the edges up again. While she was doing that, Zig was working on her left eye with the paintbrush and kept telling her to hold her head up. When Sharon got a chance to see in the mirror again, she could hardly recognise herself. There was a big black patch all around one eye, and the rest of her face was dead white, like chalk. Zig fished in her bag and pulled out a piece of red tartan, clipped the edge of it, then ripped off a strip about 2 inches wide. That made a sort of headband, tied around under Sharon's hair and over the ears, finishing in a knot at the side. "Brilliant," Sharon said. But Zig was pointing at her legs and feet.
"Dead giveaway."
She squatted down and pulled at the fabric of the black tights, twisting it around and then skewering it with the scissors. Great big ladders appeared, and she pulled at them so they got wider.
"OK,"
she said.
"That'll do."
She started throwing her stuff back in her bag, while Sharon cleared the hair out of the basin and flushed it down the toilet.
"All right," said Zig. "Let's go."
Chapter 4. Things seemed quieter than usual at the station, Bryony was thinking. The calm before the storm. For the last few months, Friday nights had seen more than their fair share of violent incidents, street fights, arson and vandalism, mostly down the lower end of the King's Road. Repeated appeals for extra manpower, they still insisted on calling it that, she noted wryly, had finally paid off, with 6 extra constables, a DC and a DS being transferred in from other stations at the beginning of this month. Then Dennis had been moved across to her team from a quieter part of the division. Whatever her reservations about him, she had him to thank for the fact that she'd been able to confirm her holiday arrangements for next week. She collected her mail and sorted through it rapidly. Routine stuff. Still no report from the Lambeth lab. She rang Pavan. "I'm sorry," he said, in his most formal tone. "I'm afraid I've had a number of rather urgent cases claiming my attention." "This is a suspected homicide, Pavan." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "We can't rule that out, of course, but I have another theory. As a matter of fact, the Battersea Foot, as my colleague is affectionately calling it, has had rather more than its share of our attention. It intrigues me. Have you ever come across a case of spontaneous combustion?" "Of what? I thought that was a myth." "A rare and strange event, Bryony, which attracts mythologies. But it is a fully attested phenomenon. I'll explain the chemistry to you sometime." "Well, I'll take a bit of convincing on that one. You mentioned a blister on the heel. Dennis has found a shoe caught against one of the posts under the Chelsea wharf. Size 10 lace-up brogue. Not much wear on the sole, newish, cheap leather. What size is the foot?" 9.5. "Perfect for an ill-fitting shoe. Thing is, Pavan, there's the gasworks at Sands End and the Lots Road power station. I've spoken to the management. No accidents reported. But if a body had been put into one of the incinerators at either of those sites, any remains would very likely have got into the Chelsea Creek and been washed into the Thames. So let's say the Battersea Foot has come along that way. It might well have lost its shoe as it collided with the posts on the Chelsea wharf, and the current would have caused it to wash up after the bend in the river, where the foreshore is shallowest. Seems to me that's a much more likely scenario than spontaneous combustion." "Then where is the sock?" asked Pavan. "It would be normal to wear socks with brogue lace-up shoes." "Not everyone dresses as elegantly as you. Shoes without socks is a fine English tradition, especially in summer. Did you get anywhere with the fingerprints?" "Yes, as a matter of fact. A thumb and a forefinger. Ken took them over to C3 for checking." "When?" "Yesterday afternoon." "I'll chase it." She disconnected and dialed the number for the Fingerprint Bureau. They were working on it now, they said, and would call her back if they found a match. Bryony put the phone down and thought for a minute, then went to find Dennis in the CID room. "How have you been going with that checklist I gave you?" she asked him. He gave a toneless laugh. "Oh, we've had great fun, Aidan and me, poking round the incinerators in this weather. I've got a list for you of the ones we've had a look at." "Bring it into my office and ask Aidan to come as well. I want to talk to both of you." Aidan Silvera had already impressed her as a smart operator. He was Jamaican and had made his mark at Notting Hill doing community liaison work with the Carnival Development Committee, until his chief super started backing the petition against it. Silvera was unhappy about the change in policing policy. He got on the wrong side of his superiors, and they'd gone out of their way to encourage the transfer. But so had she. Aidan was exactly the kind of person she needed on the Chelsea team. He and Dennis were an unlikely pairing, but they seemed to have taken a liking to each other. Dennis dropped into the armchair beside the desk, causing an audible puff of air to escape from the vinyl-encased foam. He fished in his pocket and produced a replica of the little padlock, shiny and new, with 2 tinny little keys swinging from it. "Standard hardware stock, 25 pence. Oh!" The hand went back in his pocket. "And here's the receipt." She wagged a finger. "I dunno, Dennis. Unlicensed expenditure." She took the lock from him. "What do I want this for?" "I thought you might want to check the mechanism." "I might prefer to wear it round my neck." Aidan appeared in the doorway and tapped to signal his presence. She beckoned him in. He handed her the checklist she'd asked for and, seeing there was only one spare chair, walked across and leant against the window edge. Aidan didn't move like a copper, she noticed. He had the loose, arrhythmic walk of a jazz musician. She scanned the handwritten pages. The two men had spent nearly a whole day just going through the hospitals and checking on the incinerators. The Chelsea and West, Brompton, Marsden, Lister, and of course the Royal, which alone had 4. She moved to the next page. You checked the art schools. Why? Aidan chipped in.
Kilns. There's kilns in the basement area. But that's supposed to be kept locked except when the students are working in there, and the students are supposed to be under supervision. When they're using dangerous equipment, that is. Their most dangerous equipment's what's inside their heads, said Dennis. Should have seen some of the things they got put up around the walls in that place. Make your hair curl. He tapped his balding scalp. Which particular hair you talking about? Purred Aidan. Bryony cut across the banter. Taking all this lot, where would you look first? Lots Road Power Station, said Dennis, without missing a beat. You see, there. He pointed to the notes she was holding. There's 8 gas-fired boilers in the boiler house. Temperatures up to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. The ash gets taken across to the west yard in hopper wagons. Then it goes off in barges along the creek. I mean, if you disposed of a body in there, nobody would have a hope in hell of finding any trace of it. Including us. She leant back in her chair. Aidan was scratching the back of his head, with an odd sort of grin on his face. If there's no trace left, how come half of the legs turns up in the river? Good question. Before she could attempt an answer, the phone rang on Bryony's desk. It was Ken Keegan, the lab liaison sergeant. I'm at C3, ma'am, he said. We've got a match on those fingerprints. Seems we're dealing with a well-known customer. Leonard Dignall, aged 24, released from Brixton 13 days ago, Saturday 12th of June. Done 4 years of a 5-year stretch out on good behaviour. So what was he in for? Part of the Daltrey gang. And he only got 5 years? I thought they were all in for life. Accessory. Pleaded he was young and misled. Well, if there's any whiff for the Daltrey gang, this will be a case for C1. Scores being settled, most probably. She put the phone down and reported the news. You two better get over to Brixton, see if they can identify that shoe. It would at least tell us whether Leonard Dignall is the corpse or just the one who snapped the padlock. She picked up the replica and held it between finger and thumb. I don't imagine this is prison property, do you? Chapter 5. Once they were outside the gallery and across the road, Sharon turned back, gave a shout of triumph and jumped in the air. I got out! Zig responded with a dry laugh. Yeah, and what have you got into? I don't care, said Sharon. Anyway, I owe you a big favour. Well, you might be paying me back. Friend of mine's gone missing, I have to find him. So were you looking for him in there? Sharon turned her head back towards the Tate, half expecting to see Terry galloping down the steps after her. He goes there sometimes. They were turning into the Vauxhall Bridge Road, out of sight of the gallery. What does he look like? Ignoring the question, Zig stuck her hand out for the bus that was approaching. If anybody hassles you, she said, give 'em a look, but don't start talking. The bus was full, so they had to hang on to the straps in the centre aisle. Zig rode out the lurches by bouncing on her toes like the conductors, but Sharon couldn't get the knack of that, and besides, she was losing her nerve a bit, with all the seated passengers staring at her. Two women on the other side of the aisle started talking, keeping their voices up so the people around them could have the benefit of what they said. Disgusting, innit? Couple of little scrubbers. What's that the other one's wearing? Rubber corset or something? I wonder if she's got the rubber pants to go with it. That's what my grandmother used to wear for incontinence. That got a bit of a laugh, didn't it?
So they turned the volume up another notch.
What do they think they look like? If any daughter of mine went out in that get-up, I'll give her the strap. I should think so. They deserve to be tarred and feathered.
An old man sitting behind them leant forward, smiling all over his little red face.
"Looks like they've had a go at the tarring and the feathering already, eh?" he said.
Now practically everybody on the bus was laughing. But when Sharon glanced at Zig, she was just staring out the window as if she hadn't heard any of it. A lot more people got on at Victoria Station, which meant Sharon was pushed right down away from the running commentary and ended up packed in so tight nobody could see her anymore. She was only 5'2", and wedged between two men whose shoulders were at the level of her face, it was all she could do to get enough air. Only just in time, she realised Zig was getting off the bus. Sharon pushed towards the doorway, setting off more remarks as she passed the fat woman again.
"Good riddance," said the woman, loud enough for the whole busload to hear her.
"I'd rather be tarred and feathered than turn into an ugly old cow like you," Sharon snapped back. She had to run to catch up with Zig, who was already walking on without showing any sign of interest in whether Sharon was following her or not. "Where are we?" she asked.
"King's Road."
But this street wasn't like the King's Road Sharon had read about in magazines. The shops seemed to be either derelict, or they were like funny little living rooms opening onto the street, with their names put up in rough painted signs. The Sentry Box, Acme Attractions, Granny Takes a Trip. Then there was a place with a sign in huge pink plastic letters that just said, Sex. In the window were two headless white dummies dressed in nothing but studded leather harnesses. A group of men were hanging around on the street outside.
"I'm not going in there," Sharon said. "I don't go in those kind of places."
That caused the men a great deal of amusement.
"Don't be a pillock," said Zig. "You got no idea what kind of place this is. Come on, it's a shop, that's all."
She went in, and given the expressions on the men's faces, Sharon felt her best option was to follow. Zig was leaning against the counter, talking to a woman with lots of blonde hair piled high on top of her head and thick black lines painted around her eyes. "No luck, then?" asked the woman. They lowered their voices and went on talking. Sharon felt she was being deliberately ignored, so she started to look around, taking in the shiny pink walls, the old jukebox, the pink and black curtain at the back. It was rubber, she realised, like Zig's vest, and the pink stuff covering the walls was rubber as well. She was suspicious. If this was a shop, it must be a knocking shop. She hadn't left home with the idea of going to work in one of those. She turned to see what was on the row of hangers along the wall behind her and pulled one of them out to take a closer look at the garment. It was a sort of T-shirt, but in soft black rubber that wobbled as she lifted it up. She put it back in its place and pulled out another one. This was completely different. A dirty grey cotton with rips across the front and no sleeves, but there were built-up ridges around the armholes. When Sharon recognised what they were, bits of old bicycle tyres, she laughed spontaneously. "You want to try that on?" The shop assistant with the beehive was standing behind her now, hands on hips, looking as if she thought she was the Queen of Sheba. Sharon turned over the price tag and stopped laughing.
"She's skinny flint," said Zig. "Just done a bunker, haven't you, Sharon? Cut off all her supply lines. But here, look, what about these?"
She ducked behind the counter and came up with a pair of black boots.
"Going cheap?"
Sharon looked them over. They were leather, with thick rubber soles and a set of straps and buckles instead of a zip down the side. Obviously someone had worn them around a bit, and one of the straps was broken, but apart from that they were still in pretty good nick. She put one of them on. It was a size too big, but that wouldn't matter. "Yeah," she said, "I like them. But even if they are cheap, I can't afford them." A man appeared from behind the curtains and created a distraction by going over to the jukebox and pushing coins into it. One of them must have got stuck, and he started poking around with the end of a wire coat hanger, trying to unblock it.
"It's your money that's the problem," said Zig. It's bent. Have to make my own entertainment then, won't I? He turned, leaning against the machine. Any special requests? You can't sing, Flack, Zig retorted. How would you know? The man had a plainer look than most of the other people around here, Sharon was thinking. His hair was cut close. It was a natural drab brown, and he wore a pair of old tramp's trousers with string around the waist. His only embellishment was a big round badge on his vest with a peace sign and the words, Give Deaf a Chance. You couldn't sing My Old Man's a Dustman, said Zig. Not for quids. You could pay me not to. He was answered with a swivel of the hip as the Queen stalked behind the counter and began sorting through the stuff in Zig's bag. My old man's a dustman, the bloke chanted hoarsely. Zig turned on him. Shut up, Flack! Flack hooked his thumbs into the waist of his trousers, head on one side. Got to pay me to do that. He started up the chant again, with increased volume. My old man's a dustman, he lives in a council flat. All he ever does is work 'cause he's a stupid prat. Sharon giggled, but the other two showed no reaction at all. The Queen spread the remains of Sharon's uniform on the counter in front of her. I'll swap you the boots for this, she said, provided you get him out of here. Done. Zig grabbed her bag, gathered up the boots, and thrust them at Sharon. You owe me back the £2. We'll settle it later. Come on. The man stepped across and stood in their way. My old man's a dustman! He had shifted his voice to a piercing falsetto. He lives in a garden shed. All he ever does is work because he is brain dead. Move it, Flack, Zig ordered. But she was evidently enjoying the performance. Flack stood over her, his face close to hers. What would brain death look like, do you reckon, on a mass scale? I mean, how would it manifest itself? Because, see, I'm wondering if that's what happened out there. He gestured over his shoulder, through the glass panel in the door. Those zombies marching up and down the street with their carrier bags. It's all over, really, isn't it? When it comes down to that, all this shopping, it's like dreaming from the graveyard. A substitute for genuine brain function. Yeah, Zig put a hand on his chest. Well, this shop's different. Now let's go. As she pushed him backwards, Sharon opened the door behind him, so he fell off the doorstep and out into the street. But it was a clever pratfall, which he instantly turned into an acrobat's roll, springing back to his feet. I'll get you back for that, he said, grinning. Chapter 6. Bryony stopped outside the station at Sloane Square to buy a private eye for Gareth. He told her it was the only thing he was missing about England since he'd taken up the job in Paris at the beginning of the year. Gee, thanks, she'd said dryly, to which his response was, You're not English, Bry, you're Welsh, and don't you forget it. There'd been a fair amount of tension between them over his move to Paris, which coincided with her return to London. So they had to disband the flat they'd taken together in Oxford and separate all their things. It felt like a divorce before they'd really had a chance to settle into a rhythm of living together, and they were both in their different ways resentful, though there was no point blaming each other. Both of them, after all, had decided to put their careers first. Seeing the crush of people around the barriers to the underground, Bryony diverted her course into a little cafe overlooking the square and sat down to read the private eye herself over a cup of tea. As she laughed at the cartoons, she realised she was seeing them through Gareth's eyes. She could hear his voice in her head, reading out some of the mock headlines. Laughter was what they shared, a sense of the craziness of life that lightened the burden of what she had to witness in the job. Laughter and music, which was an obsession with Gareth. He'd have taken a liking to Aidan, she thought. They would instantly be on the same wavelength. Flack led the way back up the King's Road to a pub called the Roebuck.
where there was a crowd gathered around the entrance, waiting for opening time. Sharon recognised amongst them the girl in the tartan skirt she'd seen with Zig on the embankment. She was called Annie and seemed friendly. When they got inside, Annie started giving her the lowdown on some of the other people there, whom she divided into trendies, beneath contempt, locals, punks, not always obvious, since some of them, like Flack, were very plain dressers, and showbiz people. Those were the easiest to pick. There was a tall man with wavy blonde hair standing at the bar who seemed to be attracting a lot of attention, partly because he was very good-looking, and partly because he was talking loudly and calling everybody darling. His drinking companion was the other extreme, fat and squat, with a terrible old suit on. Annie said the fat man was a jazz singer who'd made heaps of records. "And see him," she said, directing Sharon's attention to a guy at the other end of the bar who had a swastika tattooed on one side of his head where he'd shaved the hair off. "He's a singer too. That's Kaiser." She said the name in a way that suggested it was some big deal. Kaiser was talking to a smiling man with a denim cap on his head and a pint glass in his hand. Or rather, the man was talking to him, because the guy with the swastika didn't seem to be doing any of the talking himself. A couple of minutes later, Sharon saw Flack go past and hiss something into Kaiser's ear, with a venomous look on his face. Kaiser responded with a V sign and walked straight out of the pub. "What was that about?" Zig asked as Flack seated himself at their table. "What's up with Kaiser?" "His mouth's too big and he's got nostrils to match." Flack gulped from the bottle he was holding. "Things keep getting up his nose. You know what? I think we need a new vocalist. If we could ask George over there to join the Suddens, then we'd be laughing." Annie overheard this as she returned to the table with her second drink. "George is too old," she said. "And too fat." "That's where you're wrong. All that fat's full of vocal cords." "Crap," said Annie. "Vocal cords are only in your throat." "Crap," said Flack. "I know people who've got vocal cords here." He slapped his chest. "And here, and here, and here." He slapped his forehead, then the top of his head, then his stomach. "Who then?" "George over there to start with." "And Kaiser?" Zig said pointedly. "Who else?" "Rotten." Annie leant forward on her elbows, warming to the argument. "What? Johnny Rotten? Crap!" "Johnny Rotten isn't crap," said Zig. "Course he is," Annie countered. "As a singer. That's the point, isn't it?" Flack drained his beer. "That boy can belt out a song through his fists. He's got vocal cords in his knuckles." He was evidently warming up to a bit of a speech about this, but was interrupted by the man in the denim cap. "Hi," said the man, holding out a hand, which Flack ignored. "I'm Logan Royce, correspondent for Beaten Tracks. You're Flack, right?" "What of it?" Flack didn't return the smile. "You're the manager of Sudden Death, right?" Logan Royce had an American accent. "I'd like to talk to you. Mind if I sit down for a minute?" He looked at his watch. "Only a minute, I promise you. Gotta be at the Paradiso by 7:30. "You get bottled if you turn up at the Paradiso in that hat," said Flack. The man chuckled and drained a couple of inches from his pint. "Bottled," he said. "What's bottled?" "Bottled is when they throw bottles at you," said Zig. "If you're lucky, it's not the broken ones." "That's good." The man looked genuinely delighted, not least at the sight of Zig's cleavage. "That's very good. Bottled. I'm studying how people talk over here, see?" He pulled the cap off to reveal a lot of flat, mousy hair hanging about his neck. "But I take your point. I haven't quite got the look yet. In New York, they're still modeling John Lennon." Flack stuck his finger in a wide-open mouth and mimed a vomit. I know. The American took another gulp of his drink.
Peace and love and the whole damn thing isn't your thing. As a matter of fact, I'm writing an article about hate culture for my magazine. I'd like to do an interview with you.
About what? You want to know what I ate? You want a list or something?
Well, matter of fact, I saw someone walking around this afternoon in a T-shirt with a list of hates on it. But no, I don't want any lists. I'd like to dig a little deeper, find out what's going on underneath. Last time I was over here, just a month ago, your papers were full of stuff about that by-election in Leicester, where the National Front polled 15%. Now I walk along the street outside this pub, and what do I see? People wearing swastika signs like your friend Kaiser, and T-shirts with destroy written on them.
Flack made a sort of cackling noise. Logan turned on him.
It's a joke, is it?
It's the reactions that are a joke, said Zig.
Is that right?
Flack was ready with the follow-up.
Little old England's so bloody proud of defeating the Nazis. If they think anyone's going to take that away from them, they go ballistic. All these people with their little grey lives in their little grey streets, walking round thinking to themselves, well, we done those nasty Nazis in, didn't we? What else have they got to feel good about?
You're playing with fire, man, Logan growled.
Oh, really?
Flack showed his teeth in an ugly smile.
I love fire. Here, I'll show you something.
He fished a box of matches out of the pocket in his trousers and laid it on the table.
Got a cigarette on you?
Logan held out an open pack. Extracting 2 of them, Flack said,
When I give you the nod, I want you to light these fags, but you've got to do it right. Both with the same match, one after the other, no messing about. Got that?
Yes, sir.
Logan gave a mock salute. Flack put the cigarettes in his mouth, 1 in each corner, and nodded. When they were lit, he took a few puffs, so the fags glowed and streams of smoke came out of his nostrils, then opened his mouth wide and swallowed. A few long seconds passed before he started making chewing movements with his jaw and pushed both the cigarettes out through his lips, still lighted. He offered one to Logan.
No thanks, he said. I know where it's been. Where'd you learn to do a trick like that?
That's not trickery. That's science. Everything to do with fire is science.
Flack dropped one of the cigarettes and crushed it with his boot, then held up the other one about 2 inches from Logan's nose.
Ever heard of spontaneous combustion? People seem to think it's a bit of a mystery. Stupid people, that is. In fact, once you know how it works, it's just a matter of technique. It's a matter of putting a light to exactly the right place on the human anatomy. The wick effect, they call it. Turns you into a fireball, consuming your own melted fat. You can burn a human body to a crisp that way. Except for the legs. For some reason, the legs and feet often get left over, hanging around as if they didn't even know anything had happened to the rest of the system. Is that sort of thing you mean by playing with fire?
Logan moved back a bit, but he kept his cool.
Not exactly. I was in San Francisco at the time of the Manson murders. One of the effects they had, was they changed the sense of humor. All sorts of things just didn't seem funny anymore. Hate culture. When it bites, it has a tendency to snap your head off.
If you want to get to the Paradiso, you better split, said Flack. There's a bloke in a leather mask on the door, and if it's getting full, he selects the punters by their looks. I don't fancy your chances. Logan got up from his seat and finished his beer standing.
Cambridge rapist masks. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about, see? I'll be at the Chelsea drugstore tomorrow, 12:30, Flack. You talk to me, I'll buy you lunch.
Oh, how lovely.
Flack watched him leave, then announced loudly,
I wouldn't be seen dead in the Chelsea drugstore.
Annie was wide-eyed.
If he's a journalist, why don't you talk to him? A lot of people read beaten tracks. I've seen it on the magazine stands next to New Musical Express. How can you expect to make it in the rock music business if you don't even want to get in the music magazines? Tell you what I think, said Zig. I think you were riled because he was talking to Kaiser. You two aren't exactly hitting it off, are you?
Flack raised his eyebrows. Hitting it off. Interesting expression, that. I could hit Kaiser off the face of the planet, no trouble. Zig was stony-faced.
Maybe that's what you've done to Sol, is it? Where's he gone, Flack? I haven't seen him for over a week.
Maybe you haven't looked in the right places.
I went looking for him this afternoon at the Tate, in the Blake room.
Oh, you can see all sorts of things in there. Tiger, burning bright. Anyway, got to go. He stood up, but so did Zig. She grabbed Flack's arm and pulled him towards her.
Don't piss me about. I want to know where he is.
Flack had gone very still and was staring back at her. I reckon Sol's gone into the jungle. He's heard the call of the wild. Chapter 7. It was still light when they came out of the pub, and the King's Road was even more crowded than before. They crossed it, went through a passageway between some shops, and came out into a precinct where there were high-rise buildings all around. Sharon jumped to avoid a kid hurtling towards her on a bike, his legs stuck out either side of him, and the front wheel rearing in the air. But she stepped right into the path of another rider, going in circles with his feet on the handlebars. In a reflex, she stuck her arms out to block the collision and found herself with a two-handed grip on his front wheel. Luckily, the boy was running out of momentum, and it wasn't a high-speed catch, though it left her with a nasty scratch up her forearm from the edge of the mudguard. "You want to watch out, you do," she snapped, recoiling and inspecting the hurt arm.
"You want to watch it, you do?"
the boy mimicked in falsetto, pushing himself off again. A group of smaller kids without bikes, who'd assembled from nowhere, started laughing. Zig had already disappeared around the side of the next building, so Sharon sprinted after her and found herself in an alleyway with brick walls on either side, topped by a layer of wire mesh fence. "World's End Passage," said the sign on the wall. A netball post, rising above the mesh, gave away that there was a school in there. Zig had at last turned to wait for her. "Thanks for rescuing me back there," Sharon called, slowing to get her breath back. "I nearly got decked by a bunch of evil hobbits."
"Takes one to know one,"
said Zig. But before they'd reached the end of the passageway, they were forced against the wall by a weighty kid riding his bike full throttle with the evident intention of skittling them from behind. Once he'd overtaken them, he skidded to a halt and turned on them, blocking the exit.
"You spikers," he called out. "I know where you come from."
Sharon guessed the kid was no more than 10 years old, but he was a force to be reckoned with, and she was glad to be with someone who knew how to keep their cool. She let Zig do the talking.
"I know where yous live."
The kid seemed to be winding up to something.
"Lots Road, didn't ya?" "Can't remember,"
Zig drawled, lighting a cigarette.
"I might have moved."
He was closing in, propelling the bike forward with his feet on the ground either side.
"You're pulling my pisser."
"Not likely." Zig looked up, channeling a stream of smoke into the air above her.
"Wouldn't touch it with a barge pole." "You lived in Sol's place. I seen you round there."
He planted a foot on the ground and folded his arms.
"Sol owes me money." "Well, that's his problem. Nothing to do with us, is it?" "It is if I can't find him. Somebody's got to pay."
"Pay for what?" Sharon couldn't resist buying into the dialogue.
"Deliveries. Every week. 50p for delivering the yellow magazines."
"All right," said Zig.
"Where are they then?" "Had to take 'em back, didn't I?" Sol wasn't there, so I had to take them back. That's 50p each way. Give me £1 and we call it quits.
Zig laughed. Nice try. Bring him down to Lots Road in half an hour and I'll give you the 50p. And here, she tossed him a cigarette, here's your bonus. They emerged from the World's End Passage and cut across a park into an area of little streets lined with poky, run-down terraces. Above the roof lines rose 2 giant red brick chimneys. "What's the factory?" Sharon asked. Zig sucked in smoke from her fag and took her time answering.
Lots Road Power Station. It's where all the power comes from for the tubes, or used to.
They seemed to be walking towards it, and eventually rounded a corner into a street where the wall of the building rose up in front of them, overshadowing the squashed row of houses opposite. Zig stopped outside a door with paint flaking off it. Like the other houses, it had steps down to an extra floor below the street, but they were heaped with rubbish and didn't seem to lead to any entrance. She followed Zig inside. Her first thought was that she must be seeing double. The place they were in seemed to be completely different from the one she'd seen from the street. For a start, it was twice the size. The filth on the windows blocked most of the light, so it was hard to see exactly the extent of it, but from where she was standing, there didn't seem to be any walls. Then the penny dropped. It was actually 2 houses, with the adjoining wall knocked out. Zig led the way over to a staircase at the far end, where there was some light coming from above, enough to reveal the lines of a giant figure painted on the wall, stepping upward as if it was climbing the stairs. Sharon stared at it.
Who did that? She asked. Recognise it, do you? That's Sol's work. It's a copy, but maybe you've already figured that out.
It's the ghost of a flea, isn't it? The Blake picture.
Zig was already at the top of the stairs, but Sharon hesitated to follow her.
So, what's this place? You don't live here, do you?
It's a squat. Haven't you ever been in a squat before? You're a bit wet behind the ears, aren't you? Come on up.
I know what a squat is.
Sharon took the stairs slowly, following the sweeping lines of the figure painted on the wall beside her. On the landing, there was a window in which someone had cleaned a patch. She put her face up to it and looked out over a row of little garden squares, divided up by brick walls. Zig pulled her away.
Nothing out there,
she said. She opened a door that led into a room facing the front of the house, with real daylight coming through clear windows. It was a sitting room with fat old armchairs and carpet on the floor. A black cat sat poised on the back of one of the chairs, swishing its tail and meowing at the intrusion. "Hello, puss." Sharon stroked the cat's neck with a finger, and it settled with its belly against the chair, claws catching at the fabric. "What's its name?"
Cat.
"Doesn't it have a name?"
Its name is Cat. Belongs to Sol.
Sharon looked around at the shabby furniture, noticing that the arm of one of the chairs was stuck full of scissors and pieces of kitchen cutlery. "So, you actually live here? It's a bit dark downstairs, isn't it? Do you get electricity?"
Up here we do. Not officially, of course, but Sol managed to plug us into next door's wiring.
Zig flicked the light switch to demonstrate. "Why did they knock the walls down?"
"And what's the price of fish? And what colour knickers does the Queen wear? Ask a lot of questions, don't you?"
"Sorry, just one more. Does Sol live here?" Zig flung herself on the settee.
"Yes, he's got a workshop down in the basement full of stuff."
She was staring out of the window, avoiding eye contact. "Is he your boyfriend?" Zig flashed her a look of contempt.
"What do you think?"
Sharon blushed. "Why don't we go and have a look round his studio, see if we can find any clues about where he's gone?"
Can't get in. It's locked.
You sure you can't get in? I mean, if he's really missing, somebody ought to check it out, oughtn't they? How do you know he's not lying unconscious on the floor or something?
There's no way he could have locked himself in because the door's padlocked on the outside.
Maybe we could break in. Zig shook her head in exasperation, but she was already getting up from the chair.
It's a bloody great padlock. You'd need a hacksaw or something.
Well, you're not short of hardware by the looks. Sharon was inspecting the weaponry stuck in the arm of the chair. She pulled out a corkscrew and a pair of fine-bladed scissors. Let's have a go.
Don't give up easily, do you?
Zig took the corkscrew from her, picked up a big black torch from one of the boxes, and led the way back downstairs. The cat ran ahead of them, but stopped a few feet away from the bottom step, its eyes still visible in the dimness.
Move it, cat.
Zig gave it a prompt with her foot. Then she bent down and pulled up a piece of floorboard. There were 3 short planks covering a square hole in the floor, through which the cat instantly disappeared. Zig went after it, and Sharon followed. It was dark down there, and the light from Zig's torch wasn't a lot of help as she negotiated the rickety steps to the lower floor. When her feet touched the ground, she saw what Zig was talking about. In front of them was a bolted door, with a hefty-looking padlock attached to the bolt. The cat was staring up at it and meowing vigorously. Zig handed Sharon the torch and started probing the lock with the tip of the corkscrew.
Useless,
she concluded in a matter of seconds. She exchanged the corkscrew for the scissors and tried again, swearing as one of the blades snapped. What about trying with a safety pin? Sharon took one out of her shirt and handed over the torch, but it wasn't any good. She couldn't get the point far enough in. "What's that noise?" she asked, stopping for a minute.
It's a factory. They run trucks underground.
The distant rumblings suddenly got drowned out by a battering on the front door.
Conker,
said Zig.
What? The boy with the fanzines calls himself Conker.
Chapter 8. Friday was Bryony's first day off in 3 weeks, but she was up at 7 to be ready for the call from Gareth, who was ringing from Paris, where the clocks were an hour ahead. She had time for a shower and a bowl of muesli before the phone rang right on cue at 7:30. "Bry, I didn't wake you up then?" The voice never failed to work on her, with its Welsh lilt at the end of the question. "This is late by my standards. You should remember that." "Perhaps I should, but it's so long since we actually spent a night together." I know. She had been forced to cancel their last planned weekend to prepare for a court appearance. "Only a few days to go now." "So you're all set then? No last-minute emergencies this time, promise?" "I promise," she said. "How was your week? Did you get your private eye?" "Thanks, Bryony. 15 pence well spent. Good cover. An elephant with a circus clown in tow. Just about sums up the state of Britain, doesn't it?" "Well, don't blame me for that. What have you been up to, anyway? Are you still on the David Bowie bandwagon?" "Me and half the journalists in Paris. That's what's so frustrating, see? Everyone's after the scandal. If they'd only let me write about the fella's music. You playing the album?" Gareth had sent her station to station for her birthday, together with a designer-dressed box of French chocolates. She was toying with its spotted satin ribbon and smiling. "Oh, yeah, I'm eating champagne truffles and listening to Wild is the Wind." "I thought you'd go for that one. I like the title track. Takes a bit of getting to know, but it's a new direction for him, see? That's what the whole tour is about. Not that you'd know it from the press coverage here. His last concert in Paris was cancelled. 2 weeks ago, that was. But they're still trying to beat up the Führer about those comments he made in Sweden." "What comments?" "Sorry, Gareth, but I don't get to keep up with all the rock and roll news."
We'll have to see about that then, won't we? More rock and roll for Bryony. You really don't know what he said? Tell. He said, I believe Britain could benefit from a fascist leader. Pop stars who try to talk politics. I mean, they're asking for it. I could earn a fortune if I wanted to spend all my time trying to dig up evidence that he's a fully initiated Nazi. Do you think he is? Course not. Just a bit of a stirrer. I don't like that kind of stirring. I saw someone on the King's Road yesterday with a swastika dangling from his ear. What's that supposed to mean? Playing dress-up, he said. That's what the King's Road's all about, isn't it? I don't suppose most of these kids even know who the Nazis were. They're just messing about with the image. That's probably right. But they're wide open to manipulation by anyone who's got something more serious in mind. Now listen, you're not going crusading against any local Nazis until after our holiday. She laughed. Don't worry, things are looking pretty quiet at the station just now. Liar, said a voice in her head. But she pressed on. The heat's put everyone in a daze. All the psychos are lolling around in the parks eating ice cream and staring at the blue sky. I wonder if the blue sky stretches as far as Aberystwyth, said Gareth. I doubt it somehow. It never used to. Well, it was your idea to go there. Anyway, I don't care what the weather's like. Neither do I. 2 whole weeks, Bri. It was the longest they'd spent together in a year. After she'd put the phone down, she went and stared at the overflowing washing basket. At the top were the canvas slacks she'd worn on Tuesday to go poking around the Thames foreshore. They looked beyond it, really. She dropped them into the bin and bundled the rest of the washing into a plastic bag, then opened the wardrobe, wondering what she had to put in a holiday suitcase. Not much. A couple of pairs of jeans, not of the latest cut, beat-up sandals, some limp T-shirts, and her blue parka, which she'd probably have to wear over everything anyway. The Aberystwyth seafront could be pretty bracing, even in summer. But then again, best be optimistic, as Gareth was fond of saying. Should she take a swimsuit? An unfamiliar thought occurred to her. She could go shopping. It was her day off, so why shouldn't she? She could shame the devil and actually go and buy some clothes. Nice ones, in colours that went together. She looked at her reflection as she shut the wardrobe. At least the regime of all work and no play was keeping her lean. Not so bad for 33 and a few days, was she? Yes, she would buy a swimsuit. She dragged the washing bag down to the laundrette, then took the bus to Oxford Street, and had a pleasant morning wandering about trying things on, letting the shop assistants play at putting things together for her. That looks fabulous on you, said one of the girls in Miss Selfridge. Inspecting her image in the mirror, Bryony thought she wouldn't go quite as far as to say that, though the short khaki skirt with matching espadrilles suited her, for sure, and the loose-cut cheesecloth top suited the skirt, and the wide plaited belt was a nice touch. What about these? The assistant captured a string of heavy amber-coloured beads from a stand on the counter and slipped them over Bryony's head. Perfect! All right, she said. You win. I'll take the lot. But I really came in to look at swimsuits. She was persuaded to buy a one-piece, smooth and sleek in dark brown lycra, with almost no back. Good cut for your figure type, they advised her. She had to agree, then let herself get talked into a matching sarong, with swirls of warm yellow through it. As she left the shop with brightly coloured bags swinging from both hands, she felt half elated, half embarrassed. What was she doing, indulging herself like this, when so many people in London didn't even have anywhere to live? But all around were other women, just as loaded up with purchasers,
who didn't look at all worried about what they were doing. She went into a cafe and sat down, arranging her bags under the small table. Besides, she thought, it wasn't only for herself. Gareth would like to see her in the clothes. She imagined meeting him at the station, wearing the little skirt and the espadrilles. It was after 2 when she got home, and the phone was ringing as she opened the door. She made a dive for it. "Bryony?" Steve Latham's voice. Oh, why couldn't she have just let the damn thing ring out? Latham had developed a bad habit of ringing her at home to ask about things that she thought were none of his business. But when he was a special advisor to the area commander, he could make out that pretty much anything was his business.
"Sorry to catch you at home," he said. "Actually, I've been trying to get you for the past couple of hours. Can we have a chat?"
"Well, I suppose so. Fire away."
"I mean, can we meet? There's a couple of things I need to show you. Could you be at your office in an hour?"
"It's my day off, Steve. Can't it wait?"
"No."
"Then at least tell me what it's about."
"Can't. Not over the phone. This one's a McCready special. If you don't want to go into the station, I can meet you at the pub. 6 o'clock in the Draper's Arms on Hampstead Road. That's near enough to you, isn't it?"
She put down the phone, feeling really annoyed, with herself mostly. She had to stop letting Steve control the agenda like this. It was a habit that went back 5 years, to the time when they both worked on Macready's team at Vine Street. She'd made a conscious effort to move on in her new position at Chelsea. Though being the new area commander, Macready was still there as overseer. And Steve was set on continuing as Macready's right-hand man, still wanting to draw her in as a rival and sparring partner. Chapter 9. The day started clouding over after that, and by 6 o'clock it was starting to rain. They needed the rain, Bryony consoled herself, but it would be just her luck if the weather broke before her holiday even started. She arrived at the Draper's Arms in her old raincoat, feeling that the morning's indulgence belonged to a distant fantasy life. Steve was already there, ensconced in a window seat and looking out at the passers-by. Analysing them, no doubt. He never stopped doing that. And since he'd got his PhD, he was determined to revolutionise CID work in the Met according to the gospel of behavioural psychology. He'd been given a post at Hendon with a brief to use his new expertise in redeveloping the curriculum. But he also had an office in Paddington Green, where Macready called on him regularly for specialist advice. She tried to be brisk and casual as she said hello, and asked if he needed a refill. She noticed he'd already drunk most of his pint. "No," he said, "not a refill, but I wouldn't mind a whiskey." Bryony waited till she'd turned away from him before raising her eyebrows. Whiskey? Since when did officers in the Met ask their workmates to buy them a whiskey? Pint or a half-pint, that was the unwritten rule. She returned to the table with a whiskey and water, her own half of shandy, and a packet of crisps. Steve made a grab for the crisps, ripped them open, and picked out a large one. "Cheese and onion. I don't go bomb on these synthetic flavours, you know. It's all kind of placebo effect to make you think you've eaten real food." He bit into the crisp and massacred it noisily, as if to prove his point. She sat forward in her chair. "OK, then. What have you got to tell me?" He took a sip of the whiskey and made a face. "That's got water in it." "All right. Do you know what fanzines are?" It was her turn to make a face. "What?" "Thought you wouldn't. Short for fan magazines. Here." He pulled out some papers and handed them to her. They were bright yellow, stapled together down one side and covered in wild collages, drawings, photographs, graffiti-style print. On the front, the word "Yella" stood out in heavy, misshapen letters.
and underneath was the photo of a man with his mouth wide open and "Destroy" pasted into a speech bubble. His stark white hair stood vertically on his head in long, sharp points, like a parody of a crown, and his eyes were shielded by white-framed sunglasses. He was skeletally thin and bare-chested to show off the look, which was accentuated by an assortment of chains that he wore across his chest. She turned the page and was confronted by the slogan, "Summer of Hate," in the same seasick style of print, which seemed to express the message more effectively than the words themselves. She flicked through, registering muddy photographs of rock groups, accompanied by crudely printed slogans that crossed the pages in all directions. Bollocks, The Stranglers, Bam Bam Bam, Live Without Dead Time, Beat the Crap, Stick It Up, The Sex Pistols. D'you ever get the feeling someone's watching you? She stopped at a photograph of a man in a zipped leather mask, with Mr. X painted on the forehead in white. So what exactly am I supposed to be looking at? In a way, all of it. If you haven't seen this sort of thing before, you ought to know about it.
Of course I've seen this sort of thing before, Steve. It's broken out down our way like a bad rash. Punk rock is the latest badge for it. There's an American mag called Punk that's been going the rounds. It's a bit more snazzy than this, but every new thing they come up with spawns a heap of imitations. He met her eye for a moment, then picked up his glass and took another gulp.
Club's office have been making a special collection of these fanzines from the joints around Piccadilly. This particular one started to arouse a bit of interest with the West End Central CID.
Why? I can't see what's so special in this.
Not that actual issue. That particular fanzine. Yella. He picked out another one, folded it back to display a page in the middle, and held it up, showing a collage of images that were all too familiar to Bryony. Charles Manson, Ian Brady, Maxwell Tremlay. They seem to be a bit fond of famous killers, see? And they publish lyrics sometimes, like these. He handed it to her, and she scanned the lines of blunt, uneven print. Garbage is falling out of the sky. Better get out of here, don't ask why. There's no tomorrow for Sodom and Gomorrah. If you turn around, you're only gonna die. Ah, you don't get nothing, 'cause there's nothing left, but we know what you're asking for, sudden death. Down in the dark satanic mills, where the wheels keep turning over iron grills, don't look now, you'll never see how, London's invisible machinery kills. Ah, you don't get nothing, 'cause there's nothing left, but we know what you're asking for, sudden death. You see? Steve was looking at her again in a way that reinforced her feeling that he was set on playing one of his little mind games. I don't know if you're aware of it, but that's what's in fashion around some of the clubs. Doctrine of anarchy and mayhem. From experience, she knew it was a mistake to show she was riled, but it was hard to keep the impatience out of her voice as she responded.
OK, Steve. This is the kind of thing they play at the Triangle in the King's Road. We do keep an eye on those places, you know. Whoever came up with these lyrics may be trying to bring on the end of the world, but that's not an offence in any of the books I know, not as such. There are groups springing up all over the place right now. They call themselves Antichrist, stick pins in themselves, wear rubber masks, congratulate the IRA, insult the Queen. It's all part of a fashion. I can't see anything to attract interest at commander level. What's got Macready excited? I'm getting to that, Bryony. Steve sat back and felt in his pockets as if looking for cigarettes, then grabbed the whiskey glass instead and knocked back what was left in it. Suddenly she twigged. Not like you to run out of fags. Is the whiskey some kind of substitute? She laughed. But Steve didn't join in.
He picked up the empty glass and spun it on his palm, then got up. "I'm going to get another drink. What'll you have?"
"I haven't finished this one yet." As he disappeared in the direction of the bar, Bryony checked her watch, wondering how much of her evening would be left by the time he got to the heart of the story. He had her captive now, and he was going to make her hear it to the end before he told her why Macready thought she should be brought in on it. What was this building up to? Was a major case about to open up the week before she was due to go on holiday? It's not just the holiday, she thought. There's a whole lot more at stake for me and Gareth. Do I get a life outside the Met, or is this it? As if by way of reply, Steve plonked an unasked-for half-pint in front of her and resumed his seat.
"No point in putting this off, is there?"
He opened another of the fanzines and handed it to her. Across the centre spread this time was the heading Death Row, and there were 3 portrait photographs, side by side, showing the mottled grain of the newspaper from which they'd been torn. The faces that looked out were Macready's, Steve's, and, between them, with the centre-line crease running through it and a staple down the nose, her own. "Never knew I was so famous," she said. She looked at the words scrawled in ugly handwriting underneath the photographs. "What does this say? Something about horses and tigers? Why have they spelt tigers with a Y?" "The tigers of wrath are wiser than the horses of instruction." That's William Blake. So is that line about the dark satanic mills in the song they've printed.
"Very good, Bryony. I wouldn't have thought Blake was quite your thing."
"Why not? We studied Blake when I was doing A-level art, and I went to see the Tate exhibition last year with Gareth. Anyway, what's this about?"
Look at the back cover.
It was a photograph of a man dressed in black, standing under a street lamp. The face she still occasionally saw in dreams stared out at her. Maxwell Tremlay, 5 years older. His skin was coarsened, showing deep lines across the forehead and hollows under the eyes. With steady control, she put her glass back on the table. "You're not going to tell me the walker's got out?" She spoke these words as an order rather than a question, and Steve's comeback was instant.
"Keep your cool. Maxwell Tremlay's not going anywhere. He's a Cat A, and they've been unable to transfer him from solitary on account of his social skills appear to be permanently evacuated. I paid Tremlay a visit, as a matter of fact. It wasn't a pleasant experience."
"Were you expecting it to be?" There was a pause. "So, did you talk to him?" Steve sat back in his chair, looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at her.
"You know, I wonder if anyone's ever had a conversation with Tremlay. I mean, a genuine conversational exchange. At any rate, it's not going to happen now because he's given up talking altogether, gone silent like a Trappist monk."
Another pause.
"Doesn't look much like the bloke we arrested. Remember that look?"
"Yeah, well, I'd rather not if it's all the same to you. What's the connection with this little rag, then? Is he getting a cult following or something?"
"Most of these fanzines are put together by students who print them up on the art school photocopier overnight. We're pretty sure Yellow originates from that new anarchist scene down in the World's End. As for how they got hold of the photo..."
Steve rolled his empty glass between his hands.
"Macready went for a confidential chat with the prison governor. There's been 2 official photos of Tremlay since he was put away, and that isn't one of them. On our analysis, it's more recent and taken with a different lens. So, who's had access to him? Answer? Pretty well no one, except the prison staff and the doctor who was called in when he sprained his ankle."
"He sprained his ankle?" She repeated the words mechanically.
Tragic, innit?
She got back to the point. but we need to know a whole lot more about this yellow outfit. And if they're based in the World's End, that's up to BD Division, isn't it?
Not if the case is being handled at commander level.
But it can't be, not under the new regs. It should go through to the station chief super. Even Macready has to keep to the protocols.
No need to start reciting the ABC, Bryony. Of course your DCS has been briefed, but this inquiry is not going through the normal command structure. Macready's in consultation with the Deputy Assistant Commissioner, so it's all above our heads.
Then what did you call me up for if the DAC's ops is involved?
Well, he hunched his shoulders, squeezing his hands between his knees. Macready's not asking you to be on the case, not as such, but he wants you to know about it.
Steve gave her one of his flirtier smiles. As she marched up the hill, the drizzle had lightened, and some late sun rays were reappearing. But she hardly noticed them as her pace quickened in response to her thoughts. Macready was not asking her to be on the case, but he wanted her to know about it. Didn't make sense. A flash of anger shot through her. That wasn't Macready's determination. It was Steve's, pushing her out of the way as usual. He'd have made the suggestion, following it up with some phony psychological reasoning, and Macready probably decided not to argue with him. Just as she was thinking she'd finally got through the obstacle course of her early career, here she was being drawn back into the old jostling and manoeuvring. Walking on with hunched shoulders, hands plunged deep into her pockets, she looked up briefly and saw an elderly man coming towards her at a leisurely stroll, smiling.
"Cheer up," he said as they passed. "It might never happen."
Spontaneously, an answering smile appeared on her face. Then, adjusting her footsteps to an easier trot, she turned her face up to the evening sun. What a dill! As if she actually wanted to be drawn into the deep waters of a Macready special just the week before her holiday. Chapter 10. As Bryony got off the bus in the Fulham Road, she had to negotiate her way past a group of teenage girls, chattering excitedly, reminding her that it was Saturday morning and other people were starting their weekend. The girls were dressed to the nines, pink flared hipsters, satin hot pants, platform shoes, huge bobble earrings. She smiled, thinking how her own little fashion adventure paled in comparison. As she passed through the CID room, the boss opened his office door and called her over. Detective Chief Superintendent Fletcher was a slightly built man in his 50s, with a neat, quiet style. She had always got on well with him, but with a sense that something was missing somewhere. Maybe it was just that, working for Macready, she'd grown used to the grit and the edge of a difficult personality, and by comparison, DCS Fletcher seemed bland and uninspired.
"Just had a call from C1, he said. "I gather you've been in touch with them?"
"Yes, sir, in connection with the body part we found under Battersea Bridge. You remember I briefed you on that?"
"I do, but I don't remember being informed of your intention to contact C1.
"It was only some basic liaison, sir, following a fingerprint ID.
C1 can be very touchy, Bryony, and they're especially touchy about anything connected with the Daltrey gang. They got some ugly press over all that, remember? Any suggestion that there's still a vendetta going on would reflect badly on them."
"But we haven't even confirmed the identity of the body yet. Dennis was going over to Brixton to check."
Fletcher interrupted. "C1 have beaten him to it. They've had chatties with the prison governor and with Pavan, and they're taking over the case. I've made Dennis available to assist with any inquiries on BD's patch. Len Dignall was supposed to be going to his sister's place in Leicester, so they need to find out what he was doing down this way."
"Do we know what he was doing with a tin padlock on his ankle?" she asked. "I didn't think they still ran chain gangs in Brixton."
The joke was wasted on Fletcher.
He passed a sheet of paper across the desk, a pink form filled in by hand, with a passport-sized photo attached in the corner. This is the description of what he was wearing on the day of his release. Usual prison-issue stuff. Brown suit, open-necked shirt, brogue-style brown shoes. We've got a positive ID on that shoe, Dennis found. Bryony stared at the photo. A nice-looking youth, with dark eyebrows and strong features. "He's still only 24, she said. "This is becoming a popular area for young people to get lost in. Maybe he wanted to change his image." She handed back the sheet. "Is that all, sir?" "Not quite." Fletcher laced his hands together on the desk in front of him. "I've also been talking to Commander Macready. I understand you've been told about this death row nonsense. I know I don't need to tell you to keep your wits about you, Bryony, but I am telling you to take special care. It's a good thing you've got that holiday coming up. You'll be best off out of the way for a while. All right." He stood up. "That's it for now." She left feeling intensely irritated. Best off out of the way for a while, as if she was some piece of furniture. Catching sight of Aidan over by the filing cabinets, she asked him to find Dennis and come to her office. The copy of Yella was sitting on her desk, and she turned to the death row page, thinking through her dilemma. Was it a good idea to show this to Dennis and Aidan? Steve had no right to veto it, and anyway there was no point in trying to keep something back from the evidence table when it was in public circulation just down the road. But actually, she wasn't that keen to put it into the hands of her colleagues immediately. Better to wait and see what the two men could find of their own accord if she sent them hunting. She swept it into a drawer as they arrived. It was easy enough to explain the mission to them in general terms. They were to go to the Triangle before the concert started tonight and observe the crowd. "I want a general report on what's going on," she said. "How can I go down there in this?" Dennis indicated the shirt he was wearing, which was bright green and cut like a pyjama jacket. "I'll get lynched." "Then change it. This is important, Dennis. We've had that much trouble recently. We need to know more about what's stirring everybody up and who's doing the stirring." "What's stirring them up is that dreadful bloody racket they listen to. And the dancing. They jump up and down like loonies. It shakes their brains free of their brain pans." "Yes, well, I've got a feeling there might be a bit more to it, Dennis. There's all this literature they've got circulating. Fanzines. See if you can collect some. And I want to know about the bands playing down there. I've heard you take a bit of an interest in the music scene, Aidan. Is that right?" "I've done time with a local band." "Do you know about the groups who play at the Triangle?" Aidan had his head turned profile, looking at the street below. "Usual suspects. The Rabies, Sex Pistols, the Knackers, Clash. Most of them are put in an appearance at the Triangle, but none of them's playing what you'd call music." "Let's not waste time arguing definitions, shall we? I'm not talking about what I call music, Aidan, or you for that matter. I'm talking about what passes for music amongst a certain type of people. Give me a straight answer, will you? I'm asking if you know anything about that scene." He turned to face her. "I don't mean any disrespect, ma'am. The business down there at the Triangle isn't music. It's anarchy. They think anarchy's an easy game. Make a lot of racket, chuck a bit of hardware about, get a bloody nose to fancy up the front of Grandaddy's white vest that you're wearing. Child's play." "So is that all it is? Child's play?" "Children play all sorts of games. Some of them get nasty. You're asking what I know about. I've had a bit of an acquaintance with one of those bands. The Knackers. They tried to butt in on the carnival last year. They don't know anybody in Notting Hill. They don't know anything about it.
They come in, smack around the place with a lot of tin dustbin lids, break a few windows, and hey presto, the police is descending on everybody like they're all equally responsible. Aidan's speech was heating up, and Bryony realised he was tapping into some background that might not be helpful right now, especially since he felt so strongly about it. "All right, Aidan," she said. "So they're provocateurs. We all know the type. I want to know a bit more about what they're provoking around here." She stood up to signal that the discussion was over. Dennis slowly peeled his bulky frame off the chair and looked at Aidan. "She'll have us doled up in chains and safety pins if we don't watch out. You heard, didn't you? I've already been ordered to change my shirt." "Sensible advice," said Aidan. "Green doesn't suit you, man. It's diabolical."
Chapter 11. Sharon managed to sit by rolling her legs off the edge of the mattress, then pushing herself sideways, but she had to catch her head in both hands before it fell back. It was so heavy she couldn't think how she normally managed to hold it up, just balanced on the end of her neck. Besides which, her neck ached like hell. The worst thing, though, was her ear. She didn't remember it hurting at all last night when she pushed the safety pin through it.
"Pinch hard. No, really hard, till the skin goes white, then just push it in."
That was what Annie told her. Now she could feel the swollen flesh and the thick shaft of the pin, and with her eyes closed she could see it in close-up, like on a cinema screen, with a throbbing noise on the soundtrack. She remembered where she was, but she wasn't getting too clear a picture of what happened last night. A lot of people had come round. Late, when it was dark and she was already falling asleep in the armchair, a party started. Sharon drank a bottle of beer, then someone gave her some pills with a swig of Coke to wash them down. That was about as much as she could piece together. A pair of feet went past her in clumpy shoes, clomp, clomp, clomp across the floor, then again back the other way. "Hello." The person wearing the shoes was standing in front of her. Annie. She helped Sharon to her feet and guided her through to the sitting room, where she fell into the nearest armchair.
"Did you take uppers or downers?"
"What?"
"Oh, never mind."
Sharon looked at herself. The clothes she'd slept in were ripped much worse than before, especially the tights, which were just a bunch of threads now, digging into her skin. She pulled them off and tossed them away.
"Would you have anything else I could wear?" she asked.
Annie did some more clomping about and came back with a bundle of stuff. A couple of T-shirts with holes in them, a pair of football socks, and the tartan skirt. Sharon inspected it, fingering the straggling threads from where it had been cut off at the hem.
"Is this really up for grabs?" "Sure. You can wear it if you want. See you tonight."
"Tonight?"
"At the Triangle."
She rolled her eyes.
"Geez, you're not exactly on the ball, are you?"
Sharon heard her clomping down the stairs and across the floor below. Then she must have gone back to sleep, because when she came to again, there was somebody else walking around. This time it was Zig. Feeling the need to demonstrate that she wasn't a cot case, Sharon moved into action and started putting on the clothes she'd been given. Since the boots were a size too big, and since the feet on the football socks were worn pretty thin, she was able to get herself half in, but couldn't do the buckles up. So she had to take the safety pins out of her outer clothes and use them as fasteners, skewering them through the leather.
"Hurry up," said Zig. "We'll be late."
"What for?" asked Sharon as she followed down the stairs.
"Lunch. If Flack doesn't want a free lunch, I do."
The Chelsea drugstore was not the sort of place where they'd expect you to make an appearance in a torn tartan skirt with a safety pin through your ear. That was obvious from the steely chic look of the exterior. So when they walked in, Sharon was prepared for some reaction. Zig went first.
She wasn't wearing rubber today, but the spiked hair and makeup were enough to get heads turning. She acted exactly like she had on the bus, as if the people staring at her didn't even exist. Sharon did likewise, and found it worked for her. She was enjoying this. No one actually said anything. They just looked. Logan Royce was sitting at a table by the window, and from the expression on his face, he was enjoying the spectacle of their entrance.
"Flack's not coming,"
Zig announced as she took one of the seats opposite him.
"So we're here instead. I'm Zig, she's Sharon."
She picked up the menu and began to study it. "Hi," said Logan. "You were in the pub last night, I remember. But I don't believe we've actually been introduced. What say I leave you ladies to have your lunch in peace?" He looked at his watch. "I got things to attend to."
"It's hot in here."
Zig unzipped her jacket and took it off, revealing a string vest with a black bra underneath. The effect of this manoeuvre on Logan was instant. The smile spread across his face, and he relaxed back into his chair. "Oh, yeah," he said. "I remember you." A waiter was hovering, and Zig said sharply,
"I'll have a club sandwich with bacon and chili sauce and a pint of Pepsi."
"I'm afraid we only do the club sandwiches listed there. Bacon, lettuce and tomato, steak and egg, salmon and watercress." Logan interrupted. "Surely you have a bottle of chili sauce in that kitchen of yours?" "Well, I suppose we do," the waiter conceded. "Excellent. Sharon, what will you have?"
"Chips," said Sharon,
who hadn't actually looked at the menu.
"And a Pepsi."
The waiter held his pencil poised and repeated the order briskly. "And I'll have the BLT," said Logan. "Sir?" "Bacon, lettuce and tomato in London speak." Logan looked from Zig to Sharon and back, then fished in his pocket and took out a dog-eared notebook. "You realize that if I'm picking up the tab here, this is a working lunch."
"Working means talking, yeah?"
said Zig, still preoccupied with the menu. "Yeah, and I get to decide the topic of conversation. What do you know about Flack? He's got a few tricks up his sleeve, huh?" Zig closed the menu and looked up.
"Can you write fast?" "Yes, he does have a few tricks up his sleeve because he used to work in the music hall when he was a kid. Then he worked in the circus, and then he went to art school, and then he dropped out."
"Dropped out of where?" asked Logan. "Which art school?"
"You name it, he's dropped out of it. Bromley, Hammersmith, City and Guilds, Middlesex Poly, Luton, Chelsea."
"I get the point. But he's local to here, huh? According to the lyrics, he was brought up in Slash and Burn Street. Where's that supposed to be?"
"Sladeburn Street, where they used to have the bonfires on Guy Fawkes night."
"So he's working in a fine old tradition. My magazine is interested in him because he's the manager of Sudden Death, but I need to know about the members of that group." Zig snorted.
"Nice try."
"Closely guarded secret, huh? Sure works as a publicity stunt. At least temporarily. But it can't last. I've already met Kaiser without his mask on. Where do the masks come from?"
"Someplace in Huddersfield."
Logan's pencil wasn't moving. "Not the leather masks, the other ones, the arty ones." Zig shrugged, her face expressionless. "Well, if I find out, I might tell you." He gave her a sleazy look. "If I'm in the mood." Got me a couple ideas on that one. There was a pause. Sharon could see he was trying to play on their curiosity, and she knew Zig wouldn't want to bite. So she took the cue herself. "What sort of ideas?" she asked. He smiled knowingly. "Somebody makes 'em. Someone who's quite an artist. Mixed-up kind of dude who thinks he's William Blake." Logan was looking at Zig, not at Sharon. "Know anyone like that?" Zig stared at the fork she was playing with on the table. William Blake, Logan continued. Tiger, tiger, burning bright. Funny how sayings of his keep turning up in yellow.
Do they?
Said Zig flatly. Logan pounced. Don't play dumb with me, honey. There's some pretty smart operators in this punk movement. They read all kinds of stuff. Shakespeare, Dickens, Blake, all grist to those dark satanic mills. Who's the Blakehead? There was silence, broken by the appearance of the waiter with the drinks.
I thought you wanted to talk about hate culture,
said Sharon when the waiter had passed on. Oh, yeah. Flack's quite a player in that, wouldn't you say? I tell you what I really want to know. He fixed his eyes on Sharon and lowered his voice. I want to know how far he'd take it, because some of these gigs of his have gotten pretty extreme, from what I've heard. Snuff gigs. That's what they're calling them. Zig put her glass down with a clunk.
Who said that?
Logan smiled. Who said that? Well, I believe Mr. Kaiser said something like that to me. You know, he doesn't strike me as a happy camper, that boy.
You were talking to him last night, weren't you?
Said Sharon. Logan ignored her. He brought out a scroll of yellow paper and spread it open on the table. Interesting magazine, this. Yella. Not a bad title. He turned some of the pages. See here. Death Row. Is that Flack's idea? Do you know who these people are?
No and no, said Zig. All sorts of people put stuff in yellow. The pictures don't have to be anybody in particular. It's just the idea, that's all.
That right? You really don't know who these people are?
Why should we? Said Sharon. Who cares?
Well, they might care, if they knew about it. And do you know who this is? He turned to the picture on the back cover.
No,
retorted Zig, a bit too smartly.
Do you?
Shaking his head and smiling, Logan pulled back from the table. I can't believe you two. How old are you? 16? 17? He looked at Zig. 18, maybe? Having an interesting time, are you, in the big bad scene down there in the world's end? You've no idea, have you? Zig divided the fanzines into 2 piles.
They're worth money, these. We sell them for 20 pence a copy. Half that goes to John, who does the printing, so we get to keep 10. There's 100 copies here, so we stand to make 5 quid each. And you owe me 2, remember?
Sharon looked doubtfully at the stack of paper in front of her. You reckon we can really sell all these, then?
Easy. They'll be gone in half an hour.
You sure there's nothing funny about this magazine?
There's everything funny about it, Sharon. That's the point, isn't it?
Yeah, but you know what I mean. That guy Logan was suggesting there's something really fishy going on with it. And what did he mean by snuff gigs? What is a snuff gig, anyway? Is it where people take that powder you put up your nose? Cocaine? What's so funny?
You are. A snuff gig is where they snuff someone out. They kill someone.
You're kidding. They don't really do that.
In Logan's imagination, they do.
Zig started transferring 1 pile of fanzines into a string bag.
Don't worry, it's just Kaiser stirring things up. He likes to make out he's into extermination and assassination and all that Nazi stuff. It was him who thought up the name for the band. But he's pissed off because he's not the star anymore. He's lost control. Flack's taken over the Suddens, and he's doing something totally different with the act. But don't expect that tonight. They can't use fire up at the Triangle because of licence. Flack's got other stunts he does for the indoor concerts.
Zig handed Sharon a canvas bag.
This should hold your lot. I'll see you later. I'm going over there early in case Sol turns up.
Sharon jumped to her feet. I'll come with you.
Zig was already heading for the door.
No, you won't. There's something you're not letting on about, isn't there?
Sharon called after her, but she got no reply. Left to herself, Sharon wandered round, taking a closer look at the premises. It wasn't a very cheerful experience. Empty, the place just seemed an awful dump, and she found herself suddenly longing for her bedroom at home, with Debbie's daft little face looming up at her in the morning light. Then she heard footsteps downstairs, and was relieved not to be alone after all.
"Annie?"
she called out. There was no answer. Sharon went very quiet. She heard her own breathing, but there were no more footsteps. Then it occurred to her that maybe Sol had come back and gone into his studio. She struggled out of her boots and sneaked down to the basement. But it was completely dark down there, and she could feel that the padlock was still in place. All she could hear through the door was the distant noise of machinery. Chapter 12. The Triangle was on a corner a couple of blocks further down the King's Road from Sex. By the looks, it must have been a pub at one time, but the windows were boarded up, and the boards were covered in graffiti. Live without dead time. Anarchy. Destroy. A time to hate. Destination chaos. Swastika circus. Stick it up. You just don't get it. Sharon thought maybe she was starting to get it. What had she been doing for the last few years but living with dead time? As people began to gather around the doorway, and she became part of the crowd, she felt like somebody who was going somewhere other than through the mill. Destination chaos. A bill posted near the door listed the acts for tonight's concert. Sudden Deaf was at the top, and the supporting act was the Crunch. Zig went straight in, but Sharon decided to stay outside the door for a while, because it seemed like a good spot for selling the fanzines. It was. She sold the lot in less than half an hour, because people were coming through all the time, and they hadn't spent their drink money yet. Inside the building, she saw that half the magazines had been dropped on the floor already. It occurred to her that she could pick some of them up and sell them all over again, but she was getting bored with being a hawker, and besides, there was a sort of a buzz in there as if everyone was expecting things to start happening. The place was still filling up, with kids pushing through the doors in groups of 3, 4, 5 at a time. And even to Sharon, they really did look like kids, a lot of them, scrawny with sharp little faces. One of the blokes came up to her and thrust a clutch of small plastic bags in front of her face. They had white powdery stuff in them. "What's that?" she asked, realising too late that it was a question she'd have done better not to ask. He looked at her as if she was stupid. "Sulphate," he said, "and it's going fast. You want some or not?" But he'd already moved on before she'd opened her mouth to answer. He was right about the stuff going fast. He seemed to have attracted 3 customers at once. Sharon decided that what she did need was a drink, so she joined the crush at the bar and came away with a bottle in her hand as the first band made their entrance. The noise started up so loud it hurt her ears, and the first song was finished before she knew what hit her. There was some clapping to mark the end, but the second number started over the top of it. Everyone was pressing in now towards the stage, jerking around like puppets to the driving rhythm. Sharon was doing the same, drawing on the beer bottle every so often, as if it was a life support system. By the time the set finished, she could feel the sweat pouring over her scalp. A girl wearing a rubber T-shirt had collapsed at the front, and they had to make way for her as she was dragged out through the crowd. Sharon battled her way towards the bar again, noticing that everyone else was buying 2 or 3 bottles at a time, and emptying the little packets of sulphate into them. She saw a tall bloke in a loose white shirt pour beer over his head, then shake like a dog so splashes flew all around him. She laughed. Everyone's batteries were charged up, including her own, and when the crunch came on, the whole place seemed to be electrified. Annie appeared next to her, mouthing the lyrics as the pace of the second set revved up. People in front of them started jumping up and down, flinging themselves into the air, so they twisted this way and that on the bounce. Sharon gave it a try herself and found she could get as high as anyone. It was mad. She'd never felt so much as if she belonged. Everyone else here was a cast-off, just the same as her. After the band left, the mood was still escalating. Bottles started flying across the room, and one of them hit Annie on the shoulder. She squawked loudly and went charging off to attack the man who threw it. But she picked the wrong one and was now perched on his back, pummeling the top of his head. Sharon pushed her way through to the door. It was a lot cooler outside, and the sky had gone a deep, glowing purple. There were two men standing against the wall of the building who didn't really look as if they belonged with the rest of the crowd. They were too old for a start. One of them must have been 30 at least, and he was wearing jeans that showed bulges around his middle. The other was a bit more stylish, a black guy in white jeans and a fitted shirt. But it wasn't the sort of style she'd seen anywhere inside. The older one turned towards her. "Nice night for it," he said. "Come to see sudden death, have you?" "Partly." Sharon wasn't too keen on getting into a chat. He held up a copy of Yella. "Interesting magazine." "Yeah." "Who puts it together? Do you know?" She shook her head. "Don't know anything about it. I just sell it. Anyway, I've got to go back now. They'll be starting up again in there." She got the feeling they were following her as she made her way into the audience again, but she couldn't actually see them. She heard someone behind her say, "Cops." He didn't even say it particularly loudly, but plenty of people must have heard it, because there was a hail of bottles in that direction, and a gap opened in the crowd. She saw a glimpse of the white jeans, and a lot of pushing and shoving that turned into a fight around the doorway. But it was nothing to what started happening on stage. There was a noise through one of the mics that was completely unlike any of the sounds the crunch had made. Someone was standing up there at the microphone with a black leather mask over his head. He held a loudhailer up to his mouth, and she could see his chest swelling as he breathed into it. That was all he was doing, but it produced a rhythmic, heaving noise that filled the place and drowned out everything else. Then a deafening clang triggered a jolt through the crowd as another masked figure jumped on the stage. He leapt behind the drums and set up a battering so fast and loud no one even tried to move to it, while a third member of the band produced weird, screaming chords from his guitar. When the number finished, there was total silence. The singer was prowling backwards and forwards across the stage with his mouth gaping open, staring at them through the holes in the leather. Suddenly the guitar started up again. The vocals didn't come in for a couple of minutes, and when they did, Sharon couldn't make out any of the words except the chorus. "Oh, you don't get nothing 'cause there's nothing left, but we know what you're asking for, sudden death." The singer went on spitting the last two words out till it sounded like his voice was cutting his throat to pieces. "Sudden death! Sudden death! Sudden death! Sudden death!" After the third or fourth reprise, most of the audience were joining in, with the singer continuing at the same rasping, unvarying pitch. A new performer was on stage now, prancing about behind the singer, sometimes mimicking his gestures, sometimes just going into a crazy fling. He was wearing a dog collar with some chains attached, but apart from that, he didn't look like the others. This guy had floppy hair and was wearing flared jeans and a Ban the Bomb t-shirt. He too had a mask on, a fancy horror show type thing with big blubbery lips and flaring nostrils. Everyone in the audience was shouting now, but the chorus had boiled down to two words: "Sudden death! Sudden death! Sudden death!" The dancer's movements got crazier and crazier, with the chains flying out around him, and the noise through the speakers getting louder until it drowned out the shouting from the floor.
Sharon's ears were hurting, so she had to cover them with her hands. But what happened then knocked the breath out of her. The man in the hippie clothes had got one of his chains caught on something, and suddenly he was swung up, high over the heads of the band, jolting in violent spasms. The after-image of the squirming body stayed before her eyes for a second, as the lights blacked out and the sound suddenly died. There were a few calls of "shit!" then silence. Sharon stood there in the hot darkness, wondering if she was going to lose her balance. She could feel the sweat on her face, and the pumping of her heart, and the warm breath flowing through her nostrils. Then people started stumbling around. There were sounds of glass crunching, more swearing, a few yells. Someone bumped into her, and she nearly did lose her balance, but there were other people standing so close she didn't have room to fall over. She turned in what she thought was the direction of the door, sliding her feet forward so as to avoid stepping on the broken glass.
Chapter 13. What do you mean you didn't see anything? Bryony had cornered Dennis in the main CID office, where she found him at his desk, leaning over some papers with his head propped on his hand. They had to call the fire brigade. How could you possibly not have seen anything? Were you there, or weren't you? Dennis made a token gesture of sitting straight as she arrived, but remained with his eyes down, fiddling with a pencil.
Well, yes and no, Mum. He drew a long breath. We went down there about 8:15, and we did a bit of looking around, mainly outside the building, to see the comings and goings. Then we went inside, but somebody called out cops, and it was mayhem. We called for backup, but it was 10 minutes before they came, and when they did, there was only one car. Supposed to be another one on the way, but it never arrived. So we had a discussion about what we'd best do, and we decided we should clear out the place.
Who decided? You mean you decided? You were the senior officer in that situation, weren't you, Dennis?
Well, as a matter of fact, yes, I suppose you could say I decided. But it was more or less a case of no alternatives. The patrol sergeant said they'd keep a watch on the place and make sure there was plenty of cars around for when the concert finished. So me and Aidan went home.
Bryony knew that anyone else in her position would be blowing a gasket. They'd be expected to do that, as a demonstration of their authority. And on her last career advice session with the DCS, she'd been told that demonstrating her authority was one of her weak areas in the job. But she could see Dennis felt bad enough right now. Making him feel any worse would be like bullying, especially with 6 other people in the room, who were all ears.
"Where's Aidan?" she asked.
Not due in till the afternoon shift. I said I'd work today so I can get next Sunday off.
Dennis met her eye with a cheery smile, as if he knew he was off the hook.
Birthday party, Ma'am. I got to keep 6 4-year-olds in order, not to mention the 2-year-old and 5-year-old trying to get in on it, and the 7-year-old acting like a sergeant major. There's too many birthdays, that's the trouble. You're no sooner over one of them than the next one's coming round the corner. I've told the wife we got to ration them. They can have a birthday every other year.
What would it be like to do a job like this with 4 small children to go home to at the end of the day or night? It didn't bear thinking about. Bryony managed a smile. "All right, Dennis. I don't know what you're messing about with there, but we got urgent things to attend to. There was a blackout last night at the Triangle. 9:10 according to the electricity board. Somewhere near 400 kids packed into the place in total darkness, with broken glass and beer and God knows what else all over the floor. It took nearly an hour to evacuate them." Dennis huffed and twisted awkwardly in his seat.
Oh, that's a bit of what you might call a situation, innit? Obviously, if I'd have known, I'd have...
Never mind. Anyway, you better gear up now. Come on. We're going out to make some inquiries. He stood up. Oh, just a minute. He sat down again, leant sideways from his chair and fossicked in his case. We got these. Bryony took the wad of pages he handed to her. Yellow. We bought 2 copies, just in case, he said. Cost us 40p. On a first impression, the contents of the magazine were pretty much the same as what she'd already seen. Photos with slogans, the occasional cartoon, some passages of writing about groups, concerts, records. No repeat of the Death Row series, but Maxwell Trembley's face was again on the back page. The photos were so badly reproduced, and the people so heavily made up, that it would be hard to identify anyone from them. And apart from the ones called John, which seemed to be every other person, the names were mainly nicknames: Sol, Dooley, Phillitt, Kaiser. Were there really people going around signing their names Phillitt? She steeled herself and turned back to the image of Tremlay. Well, evidently they had only one picture, which was mildly reassuring. But who was behind it? I assume you got the description of the person selling these things, she said. Oh, yes, for what it's worth. Scottish kilt that looked like it had been chopped up with a knife and fork, black and white makeup, spiky hair, boots, safety pin for an earring, all the usual regalia. Apart from that, 5'2" and female. Did you talk to her? We sort of tried to, but she made herself scarce. Then we followed her inside and immediately ran into a bit of biffo. Crazy atmosphere in there. Crazy! All I can say is I hope this punk nonsense is over and done with by the time my eldest gets into her teens. Can you imagine it? I mean, all she's interested in now is Barbie dolls. But you never know what's coming next, do you, with little kids? I'm not an expert on that subject, Dennis, but if you noticed Barbie lying around with a safety pin through her ear, I reckon you've got problems. Come on, let's be getting on the road. Dennis adjusted the driving mirror and started the engine. Where to, then? I'm afraid, she said, we have to call on Vince. Oh, no. Dennis let out a prolonged groan. Vince Telford was the manager of the Triangle and a major operator in the club's business. He was also a seasoned manipulator of the police, with a line in long-winded storytelling combined with a physical presentation that got him known among the CID as the gold-plated greaser. The income from a couple of dozen seedy venues in the West End kept him in the kind of style that included a Cadillac Eldorado and a penthouse in Belgravia, where his doorbell was attached to a closed-circuit camera, so he knew in advance exactly who was calling on him. Bryony stood back out of the visibility range as Dennis rang, then stepped forward to greet Vince first as he arrived at the door. You remember me, Vince, she said, holding up her ID card. And I'm sure you remember Dennis. Can we come in a minute? I'm expecting someone at 11, Vince replied, running a heavily ringed hand over his combed-back hair. Then we'll get straight to the point, shall we? Said Bryony, walking in and picking the most upright chair to sit in. It was covered in fake zebra skin. The blackout last night. Vince took his throne, a hanging chair in the centre of the room, while Dennis remained standing, notebook at the ready. I've had a report on that from my security officer, Vince began. We're getting a backup system installed for the electricity. Some of these new bands, they don't have a clue, you see. It's not that they're using powerful equipment or anything, because they wouldn't even know how, most of them. But they'd kick around and get their feet caught in the cables and poof! He flicked his wrist and exposed a watch meant for public display. But rest assured, we're on to it. What exactly do you think was the matter last night, Vince? Who was playing? She held up a hand. It's all right. You don't have to tell us all the kooky names of the groups. We've got the list. I just want you to think about the particular band that was playing when the power went. That would have been Sudden Death, is that right?
According to my security officer, yes.
What sort of an act do they do then? Vince made a face.
I think chaos is the word they use for it. It's all a lot of mouth, of course. I can't see what there is to interest you in it, really.
Let me be the judge of that, she said. Who are they? What are their names?
I don't know. John and John, probably. He gave an exaggerated laugh. They're all called John, those bunks. Oh, every other one of them is. It's sort of a standing joke.
Is it now? Do you happen to know a John who's responsible for this little publication? She held up a copy of Yella.
Oh, the fanzines. There's any number of those things. Spend your life trying to track down the brains behind all of them. But if it's brains you're looking for, it'd be slim pickings at the end of the trail.
I asked you specifically, Vince, if you know who's behind this particular enterprise.
Haven't a clue.
All right. Let's get back to the Suddens. I need names, Vince. Who signs up when they make the booking? I can't imagine you'd be satisfied with just John written on the dotted line at the bottom of one of your contracts. Maybe we should take a look at the papers.
Vince wagged a finger. Now, Inspector, you haven't got authority to go poking into my paperwork, you know that.
But I could get it, Vince. You know that. So why not save us both a couple of trips round the mulberry bush? Anchoring himself with one foot on the ground, Vince set his chair moving in gentle circles.
Their manager's a bloke called Flack. Signs himself Gary Flaxman. With an address in Sladeburn Street. Parents' address, of course. And you'd be very unlikely to find him there. But it shouldn't be hard to track him down. He's local, and the sort of local everybody knows.
Really? So what would they know about him? Vince started reversing his circles.
His dad was in show business. Used to do an act down in the Pheasantry with little Gary helping out. Pretty good act, from what I've heard. Conjuring. Gary picked up most of the sharper tricks, you know, all that fandango with the corns and the handkerchiefs and the bunnies when they could keep them out of Grandma's stew for long enough. Then he got himself a job in the circus and learnt some fancy stuff with fire and chains. Escapology is the trade name for it.
Bryony was making fast mental notes. You said he's the Suddens manager. Sounds to me like he's more used to being on the stage than behind it. Is he part of the act? The watch flashed again, a sure sign that she had hit on a question Vince wasn't so keen to answer. She leant back in her chair. Tell us about it, Vince. We got plenty of time. Don't worry about your guest. He's welcome to join in the conversation when he arrives, or she. The circle flattened into a sideways swing.
Flack does the escape act sometimes, but no fire. He's been told we're not licensed for that, and if he starts any pyrotechnics, he's out on his ear with a reference that'll get him barred from every licensed club in London.
All right. So he doesn't do fire. What does he do then, to draw the crowds and blow your circuits?
All I know is it's some kind of escape act. I haven't seen it, but the security staff tell me it involves winching himself up in chains or something. He calls it performance art. All part of life's rich tapestry, Inspector.
Vince stood up.
And rest assured, we're getting the power back up sorted out. He'd probably just dislodged a cable, but I'm not minded to have him turfed out for that. So far he's been a perfectly acceptable client, and I trust you're not going to interfere with our business arrangements.
Trust is a fine thing, isn't it, Mr. Telford? All right, we'll let you get on with your social life. Chapter 14. When Bryony got back to the station, there was a message from Steve. She sat at her desk,
picked up the phone and let out a long, steady sigh as she dialed the number. He answered straight away. "Bryony, club's office tell me you had an incident down at the Triangle last night." "Yes, we had an incident." "Have you got anything to report?" "No, Steve, I haven't. And do I have to expect you to come jumping in on every little thing that happens down this way now?" She felt herself winding up for a confrontation. It was easier over the phone, and the morning had left her with more than a bit of pent-up frustration. Why shouldn't he get the benefit of it? "I don't particularly like the feeling of you looking over my shoulder, as a matter of fact. If you or Macready have got a case for me to investigate, I'll investigate it. If you want information, ask for it. Don't play games." Steve didn't miss a beat. "Are you sure it's not you playing games? I hear you've been sending scouts out to collect the fanzines." "Who told you that?" "One of your best officers, Aidan Silvera. Just had a nice little chat with him on the phone." "Aidan?" Bryony stopped for a moment to process this. "He's not even due in at work yet." "Then he's early. As I said, one of your best officers." "How come you know Aidan?" "I was called in last year to advise on the carnival situation at Notting Hill. Had a few very good discussions with him about it. Knows which way the wind's blowing, does Aidan. Anyway, what's in this new issue of Yella? Any more happy snaps of Tremlay?" "Yes, the same one. But you'll be pleased to know we don't feature." "Look, we need to go through that magazine with a fine-tooth comb. Or rather I do. I'll drop round on my way to see Macready this afternoon and collect a copy." When she put the phone down, she realised she'd been clamping it against the side of her face, and it had left her with a jaw ache. Surely she should have learned to deal with this kind of manipulation by now. Maybe it was all part of the same problem about asserting her authority. But hadn't she just tried to do that? For some reason it didn't seem to work. She got up and went over to the window, stretched her arms above her head, and felt the pull through her shoulders and back. Then she bent forward and hung loose from the hips, taking slow, even breaths. 1, 2, 3, 4... She rolled back up through the spine, lifting her head last, and found she had made a decision. Phone Macready. That was the thing to do. If she had a straight talk with him, she might at least get the ground rules sorted out. She still had the number for a direct call to his desk, a special privilege she'd so far resisted taking. Picking up the phone again, she tossed it from hand to hand a couple of times before dialing through. "Williams!" Bryony could see in her mind's eye the raised eyebrow, the half-smile. "I take it this is not a social call." "I've been talking to Steve Latham, sir. Or rather, he's been talking to me." "Ah, yes, the matter of the yellow pages." "We've just picked up a new issue. Tremlay's picture is inside the back cover." "I see. Is there any repeat of the threat to certain members of Her Majesty's police force?" "Not directly, not that I can see." "Very well." The brisk Aberdeen accent sharpened the diction of those two favourite words. The professional mask was back. "Pass it on to Latham. I'll be seeing him this afternoon." "Well, actually, that's why I'm ringing you, sir. I have to say I'm not happy about the way I've been briefed on this." There was silence on the other end of the line. "I feel in an awkward position." More silence. "I'm told I'm not on the case, but I really don't see how I can know about it and not do something about it, since all this seems to be happening in BD's own. If I come across new evidence, I can't not follow up on it, if you see what I—" Macready cut her off. "The matter has been discussed with your detective chief superintendent, who recommended to me that you be spared the heat of this particular inquiry, in view of your already excessive caseload. I agreed with him, but for different reasons. There could be risks for you because of your part in ending Maxwell Trembley's adventures.
Steve Latham was equally involved in that case.
As was I, Williams. If my memory serves me rightly, this is a matter on which you will have to defer to my judgment. However, I suggest we have a chat about the situation. I have a meeting at midday, but if you would care to come over here this afternoon at 3:15, I would have a little time to spare.
Bryony thought of Miss Jean Brodie's comment about the headmistress seeking to intimidate people with the use of quarter hours. In the movie, it was said in an accent not unlike Macready's. What time was Steve's appointment? It would be a bit awkward if she was going into Macready's office as he was coming out. It didn't happen quite like that. Steve appeared in her doorway at 12:30 and asked her to go for lunch. Again she was struck by how hunched and tense he seemed. He always did look a bit that way, but she was in no doubt that this was something different. "What's up?" she asked, spontaneously. She meant it as a personal question. After all, they'd known each other for years, been through some tough cases together. Even if he annoyed the hell out of her most of the time, she was attached to him in a funny sort of way.
"I've been thinking about what you said, about me looking over your shoulder. I understand you'll need to be in control, seeing you're probably gearing up for your next promotion and the fact that you're a good card-carrying feminist and all that, but I've noticed you're always very tense around me. I thought maybe we should talk about it."
"Me? Tense?"
She'd drawn breath to fire off a volley of home truths, but stopped herself. Looking at him, standing there, jaw set, tapping rhythmically at the doorframe with a flexed palm, she knew there was something wrong. He had a habit of diagnosing his own problems by attributing them to someone else. That much she'd been able to figure out without the help of any psychology textbooks. She got up from her desk and grabbed her bag and keys. "Let's get some lunch." The canteen was full and very noisy, and the ready-made plates of cheese and ham salad were sweating under their stretched plastic covers. "It always makes me suspect," said Steve, helping himself to dried-up liver and bacon from a metal tray, "that they train staff here for the autopsy room, or vice versa." He held up the tongs for inspection. "And that these might have been forceps in a former life. What you reckon?" They found a table, free of humans but covered in messy plates, which they cleared onto the trolley. "I keep thinking I should start bringing my own lunch," she said. Steve huffed. "You? I wouldn't like to be dependent on the contents of your fridge for survival. I saw them once. It was a deeply pathetic sight. Now, about this yellow business, I think I need to explain a couple of things to you." He sheared off a segment of liver and posted it in his mouth, then found himself chewing laboriously. Bryony took the opportunity to head off the monologue. "How about I do a bit of explaining first? See, the triangle's one of our hot spots. We have to know what's going on there as a matter of course. I'm grateful to you for alerting me to this trade in fanzines, and I intend to look into it as part of the normal course of my work. As for the Tremblay connection, I'm happy to report anything I find direct to Macready, but as I said—" She was trying to pick the right words. "But as I said, I can't have someone looking over my shoulder." "Someone, meaning yours truly?" Steve pointed at his chest with his fork. "As I said." He carried on eating for a while, without responding further, then suddenly pushed his plate away. "I'm going to tell you something about Macready. You know he's got this place in Hampstead, backing onto the Heath." Bryony didn't know anything of the sort. She realised she'd never actually thought about Macready having a home to go to, or a life of any sort outside work. "It's a big house," Steve continued. "Must be worth a mint, though I don't suppose that's of any interest to him. A week ago, it got broken into while he was at work. Of course, the place has Yale locks, burglar alarm and all that. But somebody bypassed the lot. disabled the alarm from the control box without leaving any fingerprints, and managed to make an entry and an exit without any signs of breaking in. They must have done it about 10 minutes after he left in the morning, because he got called up on the car intercom before he even arrived at work. Neighbours had rung the fire brigade. He raced straight back there and found a fire had blown out the windows of his study. The fireman got it under control, but his study was an unholy mess, as you can imagine. Foam all over everything. Forensics were called in. Macready made sure Pavan's in control of that, and the fire brigade did its own assessment. They reckon there was some kind of fuel in the blaze to account for the concentration of heat and the speed at which it got going, but they couldn't say what. Bryony had been looking steadily at Steve throughout this narrative, and she knew there was more to come. "This happened a week ago," she said quietly. "And something's happened to you too, hasn't it, Steve?" He met her eye. "My flat in Islington was broken into last night. I went out to meet a friend, a date to be explicit. The evening didn't exactly work out, and I got the 10:15 bus back to Islington. When I opened the front door, the flat was full of smoke. Someone had got in and set fire to my bed with an ordinary box of matches. There was an ugly black hole right in the middle, through all the blankets. This time it was a strategically controlled blaze." Chapter 15. The two of them ended up travelling in the same car to Macready's office in Paddington Green. Bryony had decided to skip the "why didn't you tell me in the first place" routine. Time to unravel all that when they were in the same room together. Steve was silent until they were approaching Paddington Station, then leant forward to talk to Aidan, who was driving. "Best if you stay on Bishopsbridge Road," he said. "Else you get mixed up with all those taxis going to the station. You can drop us up atop there by the recreation ground. No need to wait." "You giving the orders now, is it?" said Aidan cheerily. "Acting man about the house, that right?" "Apparently," Bryony chipped in. "But actually, Aidan, I think I would like you to wait." Steve raised his hands in mock surrender. All right. But look, Bryony, you're going to have to let me see Macready first. Lay the groundwork. You can't just go barging in when it's me he's expecting." There was no argument about that. She waited in the adjoining room while Steve was shown through to Macready's office by an intimidating woman in a contoured grey suit. A secretary. Of course Macready would have a secretary. He'd gone up in the world, entering the realms where no one could get to you without passing through glass doors and fronting up to the keeper of the appointment book. The secretary didn't actually ask who she was, so Bryony just sat and studied the copy of Yella, feeling the stern eye glancing rather too often in her direction. Steve emerged after about 5 minutes. "OK, Bryony," he said. The stern glance became positively severe. "Excuse me," the woman addressed Steve. "Commander Macready has a 3:15 appointment with Detective Inspector Williams. We must not keep him waiting, so I trust you won't overrun your meeting time." Steve winked at Bryony and slapped her on the back. "Come on, D.I. Williams," he said. "Lion's waiting in his den." She walked into an office twice the size of any she'd seen so far in the Met. And there was Macready, seated at a massive desk near the far end, with a window behind him that looked out over the green. "So," he said, without rising to greet her as he usually did when she hadn't seen him for a while. The eyebrows were arched high. He was annoyed. "Set yourself down, Williams." She did so, aware of Steve's gangly frame lapsing into a chair by the other side of the desk, and waited to be addressed. It was a long wait. Macready had a habit of using silences to make himself understood. For a second, she caught Steve's eye, the look of a fellow dog in the doghouse. Macready drew a sharp breath. So, Williams, you're making a preemptive appointment through the agency of your colleague here. Explain yourself.
She should have had a little speech prepared, but she didn't. Idiot. What came out of her mouth was absolutely not something she would have prepared. It's the walker, sir. Things happen on a whole different level around him. As the eyebrows dipped and rose again, there was nothing for it but to stumble on. I mean, it doesn't seem he can be directly involved, but she held up the picture in the inside cover of Yellow. But if this sort of thing is getting around, I think it concerns all three of us. Equally.
Equally,
Macready echoed, deadpan. In the sense that we don't know where this is coming from, and we don't know which of us will be targeted next. She saw Macready make hawk-like eye contact with Steve, who gave a slight shake of the head. She continued, and from my point of view, I'm the one at BD at the scene of the action. Flicking through the pages of the fanzine, she gathered courage, which means two things, essentially. Of the three of us, I'm the one most likely to come across new information on the ground, and I know exactly what I'm looking for, because I know the Walker's case history. Silence. Besides which, this isn't a case that can be cordoned off, sir. This punk thing is spreading all over the place, and if they're starting to make a cult of the Walker, we can't second-guess where and how that's going to play out. It's not a matter of deciding whether I'm involved in the case, I just am. So I need to get advice about how to proceed. I need to be in consultation.
You are in consultation, muttered Steve. That's why I called you up in the first place. He raked a hand through his disorderly hair. As I've admitted to you, sir, I told Inspector Williams, Bryony, about the arson attacks. I appreciate, Latham, said Macready with an exaggerated tone of sympathy, that you produced the information under duress. He turned towards Bryony. Our concern has been to minimise the risks to you, and we have been cautious about assuming the connection between the arsonist and the material in that unsavoury publication with the yellow pages. Maxwell Trimley remains securely behind bars, and I'm assured he has had no visitors in recent weeks.
The Walker's hallmark is violence, Steve said. The messages follow the act. Keep an eye out for me. Remember? The neatly extracted eye in the little blue Tupperware container sitting on Macready's desk with its accompanying greeting. How could anyone forget? He doesn't mess about with signs and signals for their own sake. Everything he's done was based on a design for action. Bryony registered the change to past tense with relief. Designer par excellence, he continued. You'll never see another crime scene like one of his. Total control over the look of the whole thing, the setting, that guy in the pulpit, bleeding over his Bible. As the only killer I've known who controls where the blood goes. Punks are anti-design. This is a different personality we're dealing with. Somebody who's a bit of a showman, Bryony interjected. A different kind of showman from the Walker. With him, all the theatrics were in the actual scene of the murder. This character we're dealing with now has more diversity. He enjoys playing games for their own sake. So it could be someone who's actually in show business. You know, I heard about somebody like that just this morning. I went to see Vince Telford. Bryony was leafing through her notebook. He was telling me about one of the guys in that group, Sudden Death. Gary Flaxman's his name. Calls himself Flack. Trained in the circus, apparently, and does a pyrotechnic act. Vince went to great pains to assure me that he didn't allow any other fireworks on his premises. She looked at Macready. Sudden Death is the rock group that features in Yellow, sir. Apparently, they're fans of the Walker.
What we have to bear in mind, said Steve, is that the Walker's a celebrity. From a certain walk point of view, he's a superstar. He attracts followers. His fan club members are highly unlikely to be as dangerous as he is, so it's interesting what you say about Flaxman. People who like playing with fire. Well, it's like the metaphor. They enjoy the risk. Fire is spectacle, and the fire-eating type of performer is a classic exhibitionist. Let's hope that's essentially what we're dealing with. Steve looked at Macready. We could bring Flaxman in for questioning. Premature. Macready's tone was decisive. We don't have enough to go on. The only way we're going to find out what's going on in that scene is to put somebody undercover. As a matter of fact, said Bryony, that's what I was thinking myself. Which is why I asked Aidan to stay in the car. I think you should meet him, sir. Bryony had never seen Aidan look ill at ease. Not exactly, but it was obvious he felt out of place in Macready's office, consigned to a little metal frame chair with his long legs stretched out in front of him. His answers to Macready's questions were disappointing, as if he wasn't really concentrating, or was even a bit bored. They went through the basics: number of years of service, CID experience in major cases, aims and ambitions in the job. Earning a living is pretty high priority with me, sir. I don't come from what you might call a wealthy family. As he said this, she could see Aidan was looking out of the window, avoiding Macready's eye. You might earn a better living as a bank manager, Macready smiled. Does that not occur to you? I might, Aidan smiled back. But I think they prefer nice English gents in those sort of jobs. I don't quite fit the bill. This sounded almost insolent. Bryony was itching to interrupt, to come in with something that would at least show up Aidan's dedication, or the way he could think on his feet. Macready took his time over the response. Perhaps I do see what you mean, D.C. Silvera. I take it you dislike the exercise of fitting people into categories. You could say that, sir. Yes, sir. One of the most common forms of human error, wouldn't you say? The line of Aidan's gaze shifted to Macready's face. I've seen some serious mistakes, consequence of that sort of thinking. Nobody ever imagines the nice, quiet man next door has a collection of corpses under his kitchen floor, do they? Most people don't imagine somebody in a police uniform is going to kick their head in. Most people don't think the man behind the bank manager's desk is practising daylight robbery. But that's what's happening a lot of the time. Do you consider you would make a good bank manager, D.C. Silvera, given the opportunity? Absolutely not, sir. And why's that? Aidan shifted in the chair and brought one foot up across his knee. Because I couldn't live behind a desk. I like to be moving around. Like to be out there, in amongst it, seeing what goes on. Macready leant forward. So do I, if the truth be known. Tell me what you look for when you're out there, in amongst it. Patterns, regularities and irregularities. There's a lot of routine in crime. And most of the time it looks like all the other routines. But if you can spot it, if you pick up on the little system somebody's got going and you watch the way they go through the steps, then you can pick the best way to close in. Chapter 16. Ma'am? Yes, it's me. Sharon waited for the explosion on the other end of the phone, but there was silence. Look, I'm perfectly all right. I'm staying here with some people I met. And when are you coming home? Her mother's voice sounded strange, almost as if she was talking to someone she didn't even know. Not for a while, I don't think. Then came the explosion. Sharon, have you got the slightest idea of the trouble you've caused? Have you any
any idea? I've had the police round here. I've had the school phoning up every half hour. Listen to me, my girl. You are coming home right now. Do you hear me?
Well, I'm not. I'm perfectly all right. Just tell the police I'm perfectly all right.
You are you? Well, what about me then? Do you think I'm perfectly all right, lying awake all night, worrying about what's happened to you?
I'm fine, Mum.
How could you do this to us? Do you know Mike's been up to London looking for you? You've no idea of the upset you've caused.
Sharon put the receiver down.
If I'm that much trouble, you're well shot of me, aren't you? She said to the phone box. And she was shot of them, what's more. And she was having a good time, doing what she felt like without people getting on her back all the time, and saying what she felt like without people jumping down her throat. The phone box was just outside Sex, so there were half a dozen people hanging around there as usual, including Annie and Zig, who were in the middle of an argument.
It's a big set-up, Annie snarled. It's all a big con, and you're in on it.
Fuck off!
Yelled Zig, turning and flouncing off herself. Sharon watched her marching across into the World's End estate, then joined Annie.
What was that about?
I got that first last night after the blackout, and I heard someone down in Sol's studio. There was definitely someone in there. Definitely. I went down the stairs and I saw a light around the door, so I knocked. No answer. Then the light went off, and that was it. Zig doesn't believe me. And I'll tell you what, Sharon, I don't think Sol's missing at all. I think it's a big con. He's up to something. It's just another bloody load of tricks, and I'm not going to be the one who's taken for a ride.
I had the impression she was really worried about Sol.
Then you got taken for a ride too, didn't you? He's got a seriously weak imagination, that bloke. And don't think Zig isn't part of it. She'd do anything for him. She's obsessed with him.
What exactly do you think they're up to?
How would I know, Sharon? He's a nutcase. He thinks he's William Blake. Did you know that? Seriously. A few months ago, I came back from a concert and he filled the whole house with lighted candles, hundreds of them, because he was expecting the angels. And not the good angels with the fluffy white wings either. Anyway, I'm moving out. I'm taking my stuff over to Dave's flat in the Cloisters.
Annie set off towards the Sloane Ranger end of the street. Sharon thought of following her to see if she could get a bit more of the story, but she decided to follow Zig instead and nipped across the road. She kept a wary eye out for the bike boys as she entered the tower block precinct. But it looked quiet today, with only a few old people wandering about, carrying Sainsbury's bags, and a couple of mothers walking side by side, pushing prams. Just as she was thinking she was too late to catch up with Zig, she rounded the corner of one of the buildings and spotted her, leaning against the wall, smoking. And it was obvious from the way she was smoking, the jerky movements of her hand and the angle of her head, that she was upset. Sharon stood beside her and waited, having learnt by now that sometimes it was better not to be the first one to speak. Eventually, Zig broke the silence.
Look at that!
She was pointing to a square of grass at the foot of the building opposite, which bore a sign on the wall, "No ball games."
I mean, what do they expect the bloody kids to do? They stack them up like budgies in cages, and if they come down here, they're not even allowed to kick a ball across the sodding grass.
Then let's go. Sharon pushed away from the wall and started walking, and for a change, Zig followed her. As they entered the World's End passage, side by side, Sharon decided now was the moment.
Annie isn't the only one who's heard things down in the basement, she said. And if she's moving out, that just leaves you and me. Which actually makes me a bit nervous, to tell you the truth.
Why?
There was a note of contempt in the question.
Because I'm not 100% sure I can trust you.
Don't get me wrong, you've done a lot for me, but I don't think you're coming clean about what's been going on in that workshop. Zig suddenly rounded on her, doing the full Spitfire.
What makes you think I know, Sharon? I've been doing everything I bloody can to find out, but anything to do with this Suddens is just totally under wraps, and so is all the stuff in Sol's workshop. I've hardly even seen past the door. He wouldn't let anyone go in there.
Well, someone's getting in there now, with the lock still on the door. So there's only one explanation. There must be another way in. If the factory's got underground tunnels, maybe there's a way through from one of them.
Yeah, maybe.
Zig had switched to her usual throwaway tone.
Don't assume I haven't thought of that.
They were crossing into Lott's Road now. Then why don't we look into it? Asked Sharon.
I'm intending to. It's exactly what I'm intending to do.
Well, I'll help you.
Yeah? See, that's what I'm trying to make up my mind about.
Zig mimicked Sharon's voice.
Because I'm not 100% sure I can trust you.
Sharon lashed back. Then let's just go our separate ways, shall we? I'll find another squat. There must be enough of them around here. Zig didn't reply, and they walked up the road in silence, straight past number 93, without any sign of parting company. Zig crossed the road and went into a loading yard beside the factory. Sharon followed. As they threaded their way through a narrow alley lined with metal drums, she asked, "Where are we actually going?"
I think we can get around the back to the place where they did the last fire show. And I know you can get underground from there. That's why they chose the place, because they need a level under the stage for Flack to do his act. He has to be able to get up above the stage and underneath it.
We'll need some light, won't we? I haven't got a torch.
I have,
said Zig. There the conversation stopped again. They were standing on the edge of the creek, which ran wide and deep between the giant walls of two buildings. There was a narrow bridge across, and they had to edge forward along a rim of concrete at the base of the wall to reach it. The bridge was enclosed in a metal frame, and Sharon noticed heavy railway tracks running along it. She hesitated.
It's okay,
Zig instructed.
Just walk on the boards between the rails.
Sharon listened anxiously for any approaching rattle as she followed Zig across. On the opposite side, they jumped to the ground. In contrast to the main building of the factory, with its patterned brick walls, the place they were looking at was a faceless grey monster. There were no windows, but an outside staircase led to a door some 20 feet up, near the roof. Zig was already on her way up there. They found themselves looking out over a vast area half filled with metal drums and storage containers. One end looked as if it had been deliberately cleared, with a row of crates pushed across to block it from the rest of the building. The only way down was by a metal ladder fixed to the wall, and they had to proceed slowly to avoid making echoing clangs as their feet hit the rungs. When they reached the ground, Sharon realised that the cleared area was big enough to fit the crowd at the triangle. At the back, there were more pieces of scaffolding stacked up against the wall, with electrical cables draped over them and lengths of chain, the kind of thing the Suddens used for their performances. Some daylight came in from glass panels high up near the roof, but they still needed the torch. Zig directed the beam at the floorboards in the centre of the cleared area. She stamped on one of the boards, and it wobbled, so they pulled it up, and the boards next to it, revealing steps leading down. Zig sniffed.
Can you smell anything?
Sort of a charcoal smell now you mention it. As they went down again, the smell got stronger, and Sharon could see scatterings of black and white ash on the steps. She counted 17, 18, 19. After 22, her feet came to ground, but she nearly tripped over something. She stooped to pick it up,
someone's shoe, a heavy men's lace-up. The torchlight showed they were standing in a tunnel with rounded brick walls and a concrete floor. They set off, walking side by side, and after a few minutes came to a sharp bend where the tunnel sloped downwards, narrowing so Sharon had to walk behind. The uneven floor wasn't concrete anymore, just earth, with a few embedded bricks to make a foothold either side of a channel running down the middle, where patches of water had collected. The walls were lined with wooden planks, and some of these carried messages. "The Second Coming," Sharon read. Then a bit further along, "A Time to Die." "Your future is behind you." Then, "Bam, bam, bam." She stopped, trying to ignore the reverberation of her words as she said, "Look, maybe this isn't such a good idea. Not when there's only two of us." "Next time I'll call in the army," said Zig. "Get a move on." Sharon was getting sick of the orders, but this wasn't the place for another argument. She could tell Zig was on edge too. The bossiness was a cover act. Anyway, she didn't want to chicken out. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Oh, Sharon, what have you got yourself into?" Well, she thought, what's the point in being alive if you're too bloody scared to go anywhere or do anything? "Live without dead time," said the wall, in the flailing light of the torch, "or join the living dead." They rounded another bend in the tunnel, and Zig stopped. The noise of the factory machinery had been getting fainter, but now they heard something much closer at hand. It sounded like a vehicle being driven right over their heads. There was some low light here, coming from a bulb fixed to the wall with a wire cage over it, and revealing a round shape in the ceiling with a handle attached. An instruction diagram showed the handle had a clockwise release. "Manhole," Sharon whispered. "What if it opens up in the middle of the road?" Zig turned the handle and pushed the cover up. Daylight streamed in and blinded them for a moment. Then they took it in turns to look out. When Sharon's head emerged, the first thing she saw was the wheels of a stationary truck. She was in the middle of an expanse of pavement. Looking up, screwing her eyes against the glare, she saw sky with moving clouds and chimneys, massive brick chimneys, soaring up into the heavens. She retreated and closed the manhole after her. "So we are in Lots Road." The tunnel here had opened out, and they were standing on a platform bordered by a metal rail, like some kind of bridge under the road. At the far end of it, on their left, was what looked like a big mesh cage. The light here was stronger, coming from a long fluorescent tube fixed to the wall above, and thick cables ran down through the centre of the cage. If that was a lift shaft, there might be God knows what kind of drop from the platform they were standing on. Zig had come to the wall at the far end, where there was another platform running at right angles to the bridge. This felt a bit safer, with the wall on one side and the railing on the other. Zig pointed to a piece of red string bound around the railing. "Sol's trademark." She swung a leg over the bar, and Sharon made a grab for her. "Don't! It's a great big drop down there." "Nah," said Zig. "Not here." She was already up on the rail. "Come on." There was a reassuring crunch of feet hitting the ground. Sharon followed, landing on solid earth, and saw in the torchlight that it extended far beneath where the platform ran into an alcove just high enough to stand up in, and right over their heads was a wooden trapdoor with a rope handle. When Zig opened it, a coil of rope fell out, knocking the torch from her hand. Sharon picked it up, played the light over the dangling rope, and noticed that it was cross-tied to make a ladder. She planted her foot on it and hoisted herself up. The shriek escaped from her lungs before she could think to clap a hand over her mouth. She was confronted with a row of faces, with staring eyes and gaping mouths. Their skin glowed yellow in the torchlight, and they seemed to turn, slowly, in response.
Chapter 17.
"Name," said Steve. "What are we going to call you?"
Aidan sat studying the palms of his own hands as if they'd provide an answer, but couldn't come up with one. Steve pressed on.
"Something simple. What about John? Aren't half of these punks called John? Must have been a craze for that name in West London for some reason."
"Think I prefer Nick," said Aidan. "Or Mick."
The blue eyes narrowed.
"Nick, I think. Yeah, suits you. Now, your story is that you're a muso looking for work, and I understand you've got some background there. What is your experience exactly?"
"I had my own band for a while. I was on vocals, and I know how to handle a guitar."
"I thought that didn't matter with electric guitars."
Aidan gave him a look, but didn't respond.
"All right. So it's enough to pass in the scratty end of the music scene they got down there."
"Kind of you to say so, sir. I teach guitar on Wednesday nights. I'll have to make other arrangements about that for a while, won't I?"
There was a knock on the door, and a woman in kitchen overalls appeared, carrying a tray. "Lunch," she announced, beaming as if she'd just delivered a fully dressed turkey. Aidan waited for her to leave, then inspected what was on the tray. He made a face. Rows of sandwiches with bits of floppy cheese and lettuce in them.
"Food for people that got no teeth," he said,
posting one in his mouth and swallowing it whole.
"It's no wonder you people turned out white eating this shit."
"Never touch it myself," said Steve Latham. He leant forward across the desk. "But I tell you what, Aidan, you ought to learn when you're being given a privilege, because sandwich trays are pretty rare around here, reserved for the high and mighty who are too important to take lunch breaks, or for the humble workers like you and me, well, you, anyway, when they want to get something special out of you. So, eat up. I don't think food's a major part of the culture down there around the Triangle. You might find yourself dreaming about these sandwiches in a couple of weeks' time."
"They got beer and crisps, haven't they? I'll take a bag of nuts for emergencies."
Steve leant back and hoisted his feet onto the desk.
"Ah, I don't think they're short of nuts, Aidan. You'll come across plenty of those. But anyway, we've still got a few things to sort out. Talk."
"What do you mean, talk?"
"I mean, we have to think about how you're going to talk."
"Oh, I get it. You want me to do the Rastafarian, is it?"
Steve's feet disappeared from the desk and hit the floor with a decisive thud.
"Absolutely not. This is not a comedy act, Aidan. Don't make that mistake, not for 1 minute."
Aidan was taken by surprise at the sudden change of attitude, but he didn't show it. This guy Latham, he was thinking, didn't actually know which way up he was. He'd overheard D.I. Williams complaining about him yesterday, when she was on the phone and her office door was open. A control freak, she called him. But Latham couldn't even get himself under control. His hands were shaking, and he couldn't sit down without shifting his position every 30 seconds. Aidan let the new mood settle before he responded.
"Hey,"
he smiled.
"Go easy on me, Doc. I never talked to a psychologist before. Don't know what to expect, do I?"
"Nerve. You got a lot of nerve, haven't you, Aidan? Basically, it's one of the things I like about you. But you want to watch your tone when you talk to senior officers. Some of them might not like it."
Steve pushed the sandwiches towards him, and Aidan responded by firmly moving the plate sideways, out of his line of vision. "If there's one fundamental principle to learn about undercover work," Steve continued, "it's this. Don't put on an act. Human beings are programmed to see that sort of behaviour for what it is.
Sure, you have to change how you look, adapt your body language, change your name, but you have to find your new identity in yourself. You can't just put it on like a mask. And with the people you're reporting on, you have to become one of them, genuinely. He leant forwards, eyes searching Aidan's face. Have you ever noticed that the most manipulative people are the most transparent? Yes, as a matter of fact, thought Aidan, suppressing the ghost of a smile. Ironic, really, continued Steve, with no attempt to hide the smile on his own face. They think they're so clever, putting one over on you, and all the time you've got their number. But you let yourself go along with them. Why is that, do you think? He turned sideways in his chair, draping an arm over the back. Why does the person who's being taken for a ride seem to be going along with it? Social, isn't it, Doc? Aidan said. You go along with most things people say, when you're in company with them. Then you have a think about it afterwards, make a few adjustments to the mental record. Good, Aidan. The hand behind the chair made a sudden grab for a pencil on the desk. And you know, I think it might actually be a good idea for you to call me Doc, given the situation. It has the advantage of being a name that wouldn't identify anyone. So if you need to ring me up from a public place, I'll know who's calling, and the people around you won't know who you've called, right? Aidan nodded blankly. Guess so. Steve grunted. And are you clear about the relation you have to me in all this? You're my advisor. But I never had an advisor before. I'm your sympathetic ear. Undercover work can be stressful in ways you don't anticipate. If you find yourself on the inside of something ugly, you might be surprised at your own reactions. And whatever they are, you won't be able to show them. So you tell me about them, and I'll give you advice about strategies, communication strategies, how to handle interactions, that sort of thing. Interactions? Meaning talk? Is that it? Partly. Talk's important. As I've said, don't put on an act you can't sustain. But you will have to adjust your vocabulary. Every subculture has its own lingo, so you want to be familiar with the kinds of things people say to each other, and their attitudes, body language, intonations. I got to talk the talk, and I got to walk the walk, and you got to teach your grandmother to suck eggs. Even if Steve was a DCI, Aidan was losing patience with this bullshit. Matter of fact, spending my whole day sitting on a whingy little chair, talking, isn't my idea of work, Doc. Can I go now? I got to get me a real ugly haircut. Stop camping it up, Aidan. OK, I'll see you tomorrow. And actually, you're right about these chairs. Steve stood up, pressing a fist into the small of his back, and Aidan made a swift exit. There was half an hour to spare now, before Aidan's next meeting, and he needed a walk and a think. He made his way through the busy corridors, relieved that none of the passing officers was going to stop him for a chat. Maybe that was the idea of holding all the briefing sessions at Paddington Green. But it was also clear that big man Macready was intending to keep this case under his nose. Aidan walked across the green, where the traffic noise was replaced by leaves racketing crazily in the wind. Wind had the rackety effect on people sometimes, too. Every cop knew that. Winds and full moons, guaranteed to bring the loonies out to play. And most cops would think the punks were loonies. But Aidan wasn't so sure. People who made a policy of acting crazy usually weren't. The Walker, though, that guy was crazy. A slim file on the Walker case had been brought out for him to read, but he had to do that under special conditions. D.I. Williams took him to one of the interview rooms at Paddington Green and told him to call when he wanted to take a break. He wasn't even allowed to walk down the corridor with the thing to return it to Macready's assistant. It was a little file for such a big case, so obviously he was only being allowed selected information. But it was enough to get the picture. Walker was big on pictures. He liked his murder victims arranged like scenes from famous drawings. William Hogarth, D.I. Williams had said. Aidan said he wouldn't know William Hogarth from Rolf Harris. When he looked at the scenes in those drawings, though, and the sick repetition of them in 1970s London, there were a few things he knew. White man's evil. In every country people did bad things. They beat up kids and raped women and stole from old-age pensioners and set up protection rackets and burned houses. All those things were pretty much alike the world over. Basic instincts gone out of control. Sometimes with a bit of help from the full-belly moon. Evil was something else. It had a life of its own and fed off its surroundings. Evil was cultural, belonged to times and places. It picked up on the things people did for fun, the songs they sang, and the games they played, and the things they respected and worshipped, especially that. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. Aidan had read this part of the Walkers' favourite bit of the Bible and remembered some girl with a soprano voice singing a version of it on Top of the Pops. A time to love and a time to hate, a time to be born and a time to die. Or in Walker's version, a time to hate and a time to die. Just a bit of editing, and the whole thing turned into something out of the Devil's hymn book. A song of time and change, written in blood, with children as witnesses. Aidan! The sound of his name being called was confused with a sudden squall of wind, so he thought he'd imagined it. Aidan! D.I. Williams came sprinting out between the trees. Thought it was you I spotted. I'm about to head back to Chelsea, but I wouldn't mind a bit of a chat. Aidan shrugged. What's one more chat? I've been chatting all day, since 8 o'clock this morning. Long as I don't have to go to another office for it. Out here suits me fine. I get cabin fever as well sometimes. Look, that file you were reading this morning. It was my idea you should see it. Steve Latham wasn't keen, and I could tell Macready wasn't either. But if the Walker's catching their imagination down there, you should know the details of his history. He blends into a cult environment, like the hippie movement. Punk's the other end of the stick, innit? They want to be the opposite of everything the hippies stand for. Yes, but that's not the point. The Walker takes on the colours of his surroundings, whatever they are. He's a chameleon. But he's locked up tight. Yes, she replied, a bit too quickly. Then what? Just because he's locked up doesn't mean we've contained his influence. There's some evidence he's got a fan base developing. Whether it's one person or several involved in that, we don't know. For me to find out, is it? Yes. And you have to watch yourself, Aidan. I was involved in the Walker case, and I know how he has a way of coming at you from the direction you're not watching, so... She stepped up the pace, and Aidan lengthened his stride to keep level. So? She was silent for a few seconds, then shook her head. Dunno. I just want you to know about Tremlay. He may not be able to get out, physically at any rate, but he has ways of getting in. In where? D.I. Williams tapped her forehead sharply with the tip of her finger. Chapter 18. Sharon let rip. So, I'm supposed to play tag-along Trixie while you prance about telling me, do this, do but that, for Christ's sake, don't ask any questions. I tell you what, somebody ought to be asking a few more bloody questions about this freak show in here, if you ask me. Zig shot back,
Who's asking you? No one's asking you jack shit, Sharon, because you wouldn't know. Don't you understand I'm trying to figure this out?
Well, so am I. I'm not brain dead, you know, like the 50 million other people you think you're so superior to. And if there's some psycho lurking about in here, planning who he's going to knock off next, I'm not waiting to get on his list. I'm going to the police.
Oh, are you? That's a really intelligent suggestion, that is. What do you think they'll do? Give you a free ride home to your parents? Which is probably what you really want anyway, isn't it?
Past flashpoint. Sharon grabbed the nearest thing and chucked it, then froze as Zig doubled over. The thing had hit her full in the chest. There was silence as Zig slowly unfurled, looking down at the mass of sticky stuff that was oozing down the front of her rubber vest and covering her hands as they clutched at it. It was yellow. The stuff was yellow. A thick yellow paint that gleamed in the light from the bulb directly overhead. Its plastic container was still rolling across the concrete floor, spilling a viscous trail over the older, duller splashes.
"Sorry," said Sharon, numbly. "I suppose you want to kill me now as well." Zig's chest was heaving as she caught her breath, and at first Sharon thought she was sobbing. Maybe that's what Zig thought herself until she realised she was laughing. She wiped her hands on Sharon, smearing the tartan skirt and making sure there was plenty on her face and hair. Her boots were already splashed from the first impact.
"There must be some turps in here,"
Zig said, inspecting the bottles on the bench. She selected one, tipped the contents over her hands, and began rubbing at them with some strips of cloth that were strewn around the floor. Sharon did likewise, watching her flesh return to an inflamed pink.
"Better rinse this off," she said. "There's a tap, look, over by the wall."
The tap was set low with a drain directly underneath, and they could hear the water running noisily down below.
"Don't try to clean the vest, though. You want to keep it exactly how it is. With any luck, you can sell it back to Sex for double what you paid."
As Zig dunked the rags and got on with the rescue job on her appearance, Sharon took a look around. The faces were everywhere. Besides those hanging from the red cords that crisscrossed the room, there were others hooked on the walls and strewn across the bench top in various stages of completion. Some half-painted, some still just blank latex cutouts, the colour of old toenails. Sharon turned her attention to the things on the bench top. On the far end was a vise surrounded by drills and ugly cutting instruments. Next to that was a wooden box, and when she looked inside, she saw a white plaster face staring up at her. Behind that were plastic tubs and bottles, resin pellets, gelatin, dextrin, G3 foam. But what was he doing with a hairdryer? And the egg whisk? These were among the things hanging on a row of hooks at the back. In the centre of the bench was a mess of books and magazines, and among them a scrapbook lying open. The words "Death Row" stood out in big black letters at the top of one page, and under the heading were the 3 photos Logan Royce had pointed to. But here their names were printed below. Detective Superintendent McCready, Detective Chief Inspector Stephen Latham, Detective Inspector Bryony Williams. She turned the pages. Photos and newspaper clippings were pasted over each other like wallpaper, with slogans and swastikas daubed across them. Most of the articles were about Charles Manson and the man they called the Walker, Maxwell Tremlay. There was a picture of Manson approaching along a corridor in jail, handcuffed, but with a face still looking for action. And next to it, there was the Walker on his way into court, surrounded by police, but turning his head to stare back at the crowds. She remembered seeing that on the news a few years ago, when she was only about 10. The police had put a blanket over his head to shield him from the cameras, but as he got out of the car, he threw it off and just stood there, looking into the hail of flashlights. There was a frame of cut-out words around the photos. Manson's Mayhem, Helter Skelter, Charlie's New World, California Nightmares, Hello Death, and When Death Walks In, For the Hell of It, A Time to Hate and a Time to Kill. Sharon bent closer to read some of the smaller articles. There must be hundreds of them in here, torn out roughly and pasted higgledy-piggledy over each other so you could only read fragments. Ripper was incompetent, says Walker. In sensational court testimony yesterday, Maxwell Tremlay, known as the Walker, referred to Jack the Ripper as a bungling toady. He didn't know what he was doing, said Tremlay. He didn't even know how to use a knife. Tremlay has pleaded not guilty to 5 counts of murder and may face further charges when US police have completed their investigations into his activities while living in the San Joaquin Valley in 1970. Until yesterday, the accused had remained tight-lipped under cross-examination, but... Here the paper was ripped. The book was only half used, but on the last page the heading Death Row appeared again. This time there were the original 3 faces plus 2 more stuck underneath. But these weren't newspaper cuttings. One was a little passport photo, and the other was a snapshot of a man sitting at a table drinking beer. Sharon didn't know who the first one was, but the second was instantly recognizable. "Come and see this," she said. "Look who's on death row." Zig came over and stood beside her.
Logan Royce? She scoffed. It's a joke.
That's not what I'd call it. She flicked back through the pages of the scrapbook, stopping at a page headed Death's Door. In the centre was a photo of a small square building with an open door in it. There were other photos surrounding it that were obviously taken in a graveyard with statues of angels and old crosses leaning at weird angles.
That's Highgate Cemetery, Zig said. I've been in this part of it. The Suddens do some of their gigs there.
She turned more pages and pointed to a double spread of drawings showing figures hanging in chains or with flames all around them. Zig suddenly shut the book and began to stuff it into her bag.
We can look at this later.
Sharon stood her ground. Just a minute. You don't like it either, do you? Go on. Admit it, Zig. All this death lark.
You're not supposed to take it literally.
Then how are you supposed to take it?
Provocation. You've got to fire up people's minds, make them angry so at least they know they're bloody alive or something.
Zig picked up a piece of chain from the floor and began winding it round her wrist.
Get them snarling so their faces move.
What if some people do take it literally?
What if some people are just too bloody stupid to know which way up they are? Some people take everything literally.
Zig uncoiled the chain and wound it the other way.
Some people believe everything they're told. Do you think that isn't dangerous?
She smacked the chain against the bench top.
Trouble is, Sharon, you got the wrong idea about the situation you're in. You're used to a lot of security, aren't you? You're used to a little suburban house where you lock the door and keep the bad people out, and if the bad people try to get in, you call the police.
She whipped at the bench top again, then threw the chain away.
Thing is, it's the bad people that are in the houses and the cop shops, not to mention the bloody government.
Sharon pulled at a strand of hair that was hard and sticky with yellow paint. Okay, I get the point. We're on our own. But you've got to tell me what Sol's up to.
What you got to understand is Sol's an artist. Look.
Zig reached up, unhooked one of the masks, and put it into Sharon's hands. It seemed to mould itself to her skin instantly, its eyebrow and eye socket taking shape against her outstretched palms. And the mouth. It leered and gaped with the slightest movement she made. Sharon turned the face this way and that, watching its expression change. It's like those faces in the art gallery, in the Blake room. I know why you were looking for Sol in there. Annie told me.
Sol likes William Blake, it's no secret. Annie says he thinks he is William Blake. Blake had visions, and so does Sol. It's some brain thing he's got. He starts hearing and smelling things, and he sees faces like these. But to him, they're actually there.
A thought entered Sharon's mind. Does he always think he's Blake?
What are you getting at?
It's just... what if he thought he was somebody else?
Like who, for instance?
Zig's eyes were scanning the room.
Who?
Chapter 19. Bryony stared at Aidan, trying to keep a straight face at the sight of the new embellishments. The hanks of black hair were chopped in uneven ridges, exposing an assortment of spikes and studs in his earlobes, and a ring through one eyebrow. That is... She stopped, blocked for a suitable adjective. Brill, suggested Aidan, breaking into an exaggerated smile. Thank you, ma'am. It's not often a senior officer gets carried away by your choice of jewellery. If you want a lend of any of this, I'll be happy to oblige when I've done with it. Looks a bit too painful for me. Anyway, you've got rid of one of my concerns. I'm completely confident they won't recognise you at the Triangle. He shrugged. Why would they? I've only been there once. Yes, on which occasion you and Dennis immediately raised the alarm that you were cops. That's because I had creases in the front of me jeans and sleeves in me shirt. His new outfit consisted of baggy camouflage pants, a T-shirt so worn it was more holes than cloth, and a pair of ripped Converse boots. Bryony nodded. Sit down, Aidan. They were in one of the interview rooms at Paddington Green, lent to Bryony as temporary office space. He dropped into the chair opposite her and leaned forwards, elbows on knees. Nick is what you're supposed to call me, and I'm ready to go, he said. It's all this briefing and preparation that's needling me. No more briefing, I promise. Just a few things I want to know about. Since I got you into this, I feel kind of responsible. Is everything going to be all right on the home front? You mean are my folks going to go spare with worry about me? None of my business, Aidan. Nick. She suddenly found herself getting self-conscious and awkward. You don't have little kids or anything? Little kids? Not that I know of. Or anything? Can't think of anything. You don't have to worry about me, Mum. I've done all the training. And you're okay about this assignment? I'm all trash and ready, Mum. Can't you see that? Would I have given myself a lovely haircut like this if I wasn't dedicated body and soul to the job? Besides, I picked up a bonus this afternoon, got me a motorbike. Well, a scooter, to be exact. A bingy old thing that's probably held together with chicken wire. But hey, now I got the freedom of the city. Bryony was striving to get back the thread of serious conversation. There were things she still needed to talk about. Not exactly, she said. You've got the freedom of the world's end, which is a different kettle of fish. Don't get distracted, Aidan. You know how many issues we're dealing with from that part of the district. This is not about collecting insights into the culture of petty crime. You'll see plenty of it, drugs-related mostly, but we've got other ways of pursuing that sort of thing. Basically, you've got one concern. The Walker, Aidan interjected. And his new fan club. See if you can track down somebody called Flack. Full name, Gary Flaxman. I already got that name in my notebook. DCI Latham mentioned him. Yes, well, he's the manager of the sudden death, so he's likely to be well connected in that scene. We need to know who got that photo of Walker in yellow and how. And more than anything, we need to know what's the fascination. He fancied himself as an artist, Max Tremlay. There's a lot of art students amongst those punks, and he fancied himself as a prophet. All that about the turning of times and seasons. This punk craze, it's got that sort of edge to it, hasn't it? They think they're ringing the death knell on culture as we know it, something like that. Aidan offered no response. He was gazing at his hands, a habit of his, she'd noticed, as if he was trying to read his own palms. "You sure you're happy about this assignment?" A hand went to his left earlobe, and he fingered one of the more aggressive-looking studs.
"Can't get used to this shit."
His eyes met hers briefly.
"You said this wasn't another briefing, Ma'am."
"Sorry, I didn't intend it to be. I actually wanted to ask you about your impressions. You've read the Walker Files, or some of them, and you've read those issues of Yella. I want to know what you make of it."
"I don't think the punks are such bad news as they're pretending. They're rough London kids doing what rough London kids have always done, but with a bit more savvy. They want to think it's a bigger deal than that, though. They want to be dangerous, they want to be outlaws. That's why they put swastikas on their gear and buy leather sado masks. Walker's a celebrity crim, the ultimate social frightener. So they pick him up and put him on their T-shirts like an ID tag."
"They haven't actually put him on a T-shirt yet, as far as we know. But I see what you mean." She was frowning. "Yes, I see what you mean. But why target the CID team in those photos? And what about the arson attack? That's not just about image, is it?"
"What arson attack?"
Aidan looked up from his hands, eyes wide. "It's irresponsible!" Bryony spat the words into the telephone receiver, one at a time, each of them charged with the weight of her own pent-up anxiety. "Steve, he needs to know!" The response came across as infuriatingly casual.
"That's for me to judge."
"Oh, is it? If he doesn't know about the attacks on you and Macready, there's a whole level of danger in this that he's just not aware of. We have a responsibility to make sure he understands what he's getting into."
"Look, I think we should discuss this over a cup of coffee. Where are you? Paddington Green?"
She glanced at her watch. "I haven't got time for coffee. I'm supposed to be back at Chelsea."
"Wait, Bryony!"
But the receiver was already on its way back to the connection plate. She sat for a moment, finger brushing the clinging strands of hair from her neck and forehead. It wasn't the heat making her sweat today, it was the pressure. Sometimes the phone made it worse. She flexed her right hand to cool the palm where it had been gripped too tightly against the hard plastic. Maybe that was why so many people found themselves using the telephone as a weapon. A couple of pounds of solid, hard plastic made a strong missile. Fatal on one occasion she'd had to investigate. And the provocation was right there, literally at hand. She jumped when the phone rang again.
"Williams!"
Macready. She might have guessed it. Yet again, Steve was playing his game of hotline to the top.
"Whereabouts are you, Williams?"
"Interview room 3, sir. I'd been allowed to use it as a temporary billet."
"Stay where you are. I'll be with you in 10 minutes.
Since when did the commander come paying visits to his juniors in shabby interview rooms? Why didn't he just do what his title suggested and command her to appear in his office? Trying to avoid the eye of the grey-suited vigilante who watched over all the visits he was paid. Quite likely. Sidestepping his own authoritative role to get closer to the action? More likely. The knock on the door came well before the 10 minutes was up. Entering the small grey space, Macready looked absurdly overdressed. His clothes, she always thought, were like armour. The shoes designed for shooting expeditions on a Scottish grouse moor. The thick-tailored jacket with its leather buttons, the stiff collar and cuffs, and the waistcoat complete with fob pocket and watch chain. The 20th century would be over before he knew he was in it.
"I owe you an apology, Williams,"
he said briskly, taking the seat normally reserved for petty criminals whose luck had broken.
"I understand Latham has not properly explained to you our intentions with regard to Aidan Silvera's briefing."
"Our intentions?" Bryony registered sourly. "Isn't it Latham who owes me an apology, sir?" she said sweetly.
"No."
The reply cut across the end of her question.
"The instructions were mine."
But you just said, sir, with Latham's advice, which I value because of his particular qualifications. Macready's right eyebrow dipped sharply. DC Silvera is a junior officer, and his assignment is to be managed accordingly. You are, of course, quite properly concerned with his safety, but our view is that he'll be in no immediate danger from the person or persons who have a vendetta against the CID team that brought Trimley to his just deserts, which, I must emphasise, includes yourself, Williams. When is it you're going on holiday?
Friday, sir.
Go early. Can't you leave tomorrow? Bryony was quite taken aback. For an exhilarating second, she imagined dropping everything and phoning Gareth tonight with a rapid change of plan. Then the reality of the situation took over again.
I'm needed here, she said flatly.
There was no immediate response, but Macready shifted in his seat, looking around the room. There are no windows in here. A room without windows will not do for an office, even temporarily. It restricts one's sense of possibility. Beware of the delusion that you're always needed, Williams. We are all dispensable in the end.
You're trying to get me out of the way, sir.
Exactly. The further you are from these games of pyromania, the better. You can be assured that the investigation is in the best hands. Pavan is taking charge of the forensics, and the evidence will remain strictly confidential. The perpetrators will be looking for a reaction from us. I don't want any information about this leaking out. She could feel herself changing colour.
I'm afraid I have mentioned it to Aidan, sir.
The words hung there, in a silence. You mentioned what, Williams? Said Macready very quietly.
I mentioned arson attacks.
She made an effort to rally her confidence.
But I gave no details. I can cover it, sir, with some general information, if that's what you want me to do.
Cover it? The eyebrow